Forces, tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN.
Right now on C-SPAN 2, the life and times of Alexander Hamilton. We have 3 panels coming up looking at the founding father. First Hamilton and money, and then Hamilton and liberty, later Hamilton and controversy, the life and times of Alexander Hamilton, right now on C-SPAN 2. The Warren Commission released its report on the Kennedy assassination 40 years ago. In September, the Assassination Archives and Research Center hosted a symposium on the Commission's findings. This panel looks at the lone assassin theory. This is about 2 hours, 10 minutes.
Thank you. In the early days, there was no grassy knoll. I don't know what it was called back then in the early days, back in 64, 65, and 66. I don't think it had a name. It was just that area to the right front of the limousine, that area with grass and trees, the concrete structure that we learned to call a pergola, the pedestal from which Zapruder filmed the railroad yard with Lee Bower's tower, the parking lot fronted by a wooden fence with overhanging shrubbery. Over time, this area became the focus of suspicion. After the motorcade's long run up Main Street and the short block on Houston, this area was a transitional zone, a mixed light industrial area of trains, automobiles, fences, and vegetation. What seemed more and more like the perfect point for an ambush. At some point or other, the grassy knoll, the name the grassy knoll, was hung on this area. Today, that name carries a connotation of nuttiness. It has become a staple for late-night comedians who joke about grassy knoll conspiracy theorists. Such a conspiracy theorist is envisaged with wild eyes and long hair, railing to an audience about gunmen lurking in the shadows of the knoll. In a sense, then, grassy knoll theories are seen in the public imagination as akin to claims of alien abduction or of an UFO crash near Roswell, New Mexico. For people too young to remember the assassination, the term grassy knoll is more likely to elicit a smile than anything else. Well, this morning, I want to argue that there's a profound irony in this. A profound irony in the transformation of the name grassy knoll into a label of derision. The popular understanding of the term overlooks the fact that the evidence of a shot from the grassy knoll has become only stronger with each passing year. Later this morning, you will hear David Wimp and Don Thomas relate to you some of the latest research buttressing the claim of a shot from the knoll. The Warren Commission simply ignored the most explosive feature of the Zapruder film, the left backward snap of Kennedy's head and body under impact. David Wimp has carried out a new and intriguing micro-study of the split seconds around that instant on the Zapruder film, and his conclusion is inescapable. The only way that movement can be understood is to see it as an effect of a shot from the right front. My friend Don Thomas here will bring us up to date on his continuing study of the acoustics evidence, a study which proves the validity of the House Committee's conclusion that a shot was fired from a specific location on the knoll. So my role this morning is largely introductory. I intend to try to give the studies of David Wimp and Don Thomas a kind of historical setting by laying out how, early on, we came to believe that a shot actually was fired from the knoll. Now, there are certain kinds of evidence that have been alleged as pointing towards a shot from the knoll that are not very substantial. In the seconds after the shooting, many people ran towards the knoll and then gathered in the parking lot behind the stockade fence. First slide, please. Well, there. You see Gene Hill running in that direction. This, you can see a stream of people. I can't do anything here. Okay, we got a problem with the main lights. Can somebody do something about it? How's that? How's that? Okay. Okay, you see the stream then of people across Elm Street and up into the Knoll area. Next slide, please. And that's taken within 8 or 10 minutes afterwards, showing the parking lot, railroad tower in the background. Now, it's very unclear what, if any, probative significance this has. In the confusion of a shooting, if somebody begins running in one direction, a lot of other people will follow. Also, it's been alleged that ear witness testimony suggests a shot from the knoll. Obviously, some people clearly believe they heard a shot coming from the direction of the knoll. However, once again, if you look at experiments performed by the House Select Committee, it's quite clear that judging sound direction in Dealey Plaza is fraught with difficulty. There are so many echo-reflecting surfaces of buildings in Dealey Plaza that any judgment concerning sound direction is necessarily unreliable. Now, that applies to human perceptions of the direction of the shots. The dispersion of impact debris is something else. That is the dispersion of impact debris from the headshot at 313. This is a physical effect and does not depend upon a witness's perception. Bobby Hargis and Billy Martin, next slide. This is the Alkins film. We're riding the two cycles that are obvious to the left rear of the motorcycle. If you take the time to review what they told the Warren Commission, it's quite striking now. It's not just that Hargis was hit with some brain debris on his helmet and windshield. Both officers were covered in blood and brain debris. Their motorcycles, from their fenders up over the windshields, their helmets and their uniforms. It's quite striking, the amount of material that went in their direction. Next slide. Hargis, of course, is well known. There is Hargis having just gotten off his cycle. Hargis later told the Warren Commission that he was hit such a blow with this impact debris that he immediately figured that the shot came from the opposite direction, to wit, the right front, to wit, the grassy knoll. So he, almost instinctively, drops his cycle and starts running up into the knoll area. And in later photographs, we can see him in that area. Next slide, please. Also, in certain frames from the Nix and the Zapruder films, we can see what appear to be, you see the white mass that seems to be moving rearward across the trunk. We can see what appears to be a mass of blood and brain debris moving backward off the trunk. And yesterday, Randy Robertson showed you what he believes, and certainly there's much evidence for, an actual fragment, the Kinney fragment, actually bouncing off the back of the limousine, or towards the back of the limousine. So it is indeed controversial exactly where particular fragments were found. But there seems no doubt that the Weitzman fragment was found to the left rear of the limousine. The actual location of other fragments is somewhat controversial. Now, all of this impact debris does not pinpoint a specific location on the knoll. Obviously, it simply indicates, to some degree, of a shot fired from that general direction. However, independent evidence from a whole variety of sources is not all over the place in the knoll. This is what's important. a lot of evidence, soft evidence, that is witness testimony, physical evidence found there, etc., points to a single location. And that's what I think is incredibly important. Other locations have been floated by various critics at various times, of course. At one point, David Lifton proposed a shooter in a tree on the knoll, and other critics endorsed a drain hole near the curb of Elm Street. Gary Mack and Jack White thought they saw in the Mormon photo a figure in a Dallas police uniform firing a weapon. But none of these other locations has stood up over the years. What is quite remarkable is the convergence of independent evidence around a single location on the knoll as the most likely location for a shooter. That location is on the stockade fence approximately 15 feet southwest of the corner of the fence. Next slide, please. Now, this is a view from Lee Bowers Railroad Tower, which overlooked the parking lot. This is a view towards, then, the stockade fence with overlying vegetation in that area. In the minutes prior to the assassination, Bowers saw a car circling the parking lot and noticed two men standing against the stockade fence in approximately this location. Now, Bowers used a strange term. He said that at the time of the shooting, where these two men were standing, he noticed what he called a commotion. Now, Bowers died a couple of years later, quite innocently in my opinion, and so we're left with no real understanding as to what Bowers meant by that odd term, commotion. It's a vague and ambiguous term, and we don't really know what he meant. All we do know is that whatever he meant by commotion, it happened there at the time of the shooting. Next slide, please. We do know what other witnesses saw at the time of the shooting in this general location. Skinny Holland was an old railroad supervisor, and he was there at the Triple Underpass at the time of the shooting. And if a railroad worker would come up and want to watch the motorcade from that location, Skinny Holland would approve them, and they'd be permitted to be on the overpass. At the time of the shooting, Skinny Holland and I think there are 4 other witnesses saw what Holland described as, quote, a puff of white smoke come out about 6 to 8 feet right out from under those trees. There. Now, what's persuasive about this is that we have affidavits signed in the Sheriff's Department on the afternoon of the 22nd by these people. We have corroborating that 2 sheriff's deputies who indicated that they were told by railroad workers that they had seen smoke in that location. What's compelling about that is that these are a lot of people. They give their observations immediately, and the fact that on the scene, within seconds of the shooting, they told sheriff's deputies this. Now, next slide, please. Holland, this is Holland, a photo taken by me in '66, immediately, with his pals, started running in the direction of the stockade fence and knoll where they had seen this smoke. Next slide, please. This is the stockade fence in 1966, and this is the general area we're talking about here. They ran back behind the fence, and behind the fence, next slide, please. This is Holland standing behind the fence at that location. Next slide, please. These are my notes taken contemporaneously with Holland on the site, and this is what they found. Here's the corner of the stockade fence, right? Corner of the stockade fence. He found these he found these three cars parked, backed up against the fence with their trunks up against the fence. This middle car, which was a light tan old 61, behind that were a whole bunch of new footprints in the mud. Remember that it rained the night before. And there were cigarette butts scattered here and a few footprints in this general area. Holland and his friends found this very significant, but there wasn't much to do about it. They didn't find anybody standing there. They didn't find a rifle there. They didn't find any cartridge cases there. But they did find all of that there. Next slide, please. This, of course, is the famous Mormon photograph. Here's President Kennedy. This is coincident with Zapruder frame 315. That is 2/18, 1/9 of a second after impact. Here is the stockade fence. Here's the corner of the stockade fence. Zapruder's pedestal is over in approximately this location. Got it? Now, if we look about 15 feet down from the corner, down to about this location in the Mormon film, we'll see something which I think is very interesting. Next slide, please. What's in? The focus is off. See what happens to us Luddites who use carousel projectors? Okay. Now, notice what we're talking about here. Here's the top of the fence, the top of the stockade fence. This shape here, I call an anomalous shape. In scale, it's a proper size to be the human head from approximately the mouth or the nose up. Notice this vertical shape. Well, that turns out to be a fixed feature of the site. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, this is a comparison photo. Is that as focused as well as we can get it? Great. Okay, thank you. This is a comparison photo that I took standing in Mormon's position in '66. It shows that this particular vertical form is, in fact, a fixed feature of the site. How about here, where this anomalous shape is found? Nothing. Next slide, please. Next. Jesus Christ. The vertical form in the background is the railroad tower in the background. That is, in fact, a fixed feature of the site. Next slide. Hey, can I ask, why can't we just do it from the... Can't you move closer to the... Well, that's the one we had before. That went the wrong way. Jesus Christ. Okay. So here we are again. Here's the shape taken 2/18 of a second. This photograph taken 2/18 of a second after impact on Kennedy's head. And next slide, please. You see this shape? Guess who that is? I told Skinny Holland to go stand behind the fence where he and his buddies found all this material. So he went and stood behind the fence, and I went to Mormon's position and took his photo. It's that simple. That's how crude we were back in those days, but it does show something or other, right? Next slide, please. Here's the shape. Okay. This is a blow up from Mormon. Blow up from Mormon, and there's the top of the fence, and that's the anomalous shape we're talking about. Next slide, please. Okay, here is the Mormon photo. And let me read to you now what the the photo panel of the House Select Committee said about this. Quote, "The panel did not carry out any enhancement work on the Mormon photo in the area of the stockade fence, because this area was judged to be of even lesser quality than the retaining wall area, which had yielded negative results. The decision, however, was made long before the committee's acoustics analysis was finished, although it is extremely unlikely that further enhancement of any kind would be successful. This particular photograph should be re-examined in light of the findings of the acoustics analysis. Now, I don't want to steal Don Thomas's thunder here, but let me tell you what's behind that comment. Here's the corner of the fence, right? When the House committee reenacted the assassination by firing a rifle from the sixth-floor window and by firing a rifle and a pistol from the knoll area, they picked a particular spot to use to fire from the knoll area. That's right there, right? Right there. Now, they then gathered a lot of test data. When they compared the test data to the shot, the purported shot from the knoll that was studied, that is, the sound impulse that was found on the DPD tape, they found that they had to change marginally the position of the sound reception source, the motorcycle. The motorcycle was not exactly at where a microphone had been. So they had to determine that the sound reception source was about 4 feet from a microphone. But now you're asking, well, what about the sound giving source, right? To wit, the firing point. They determined that the firing point was not there, but there. That seems to me to be an extraordinarily powerful indication that this convergence of, quote, soft evidence, that is, what Bowers sees, what Holland and his friends see, plus what's evident in the Mormon photograph, is once again right on, spot on, corroborated by an obscure sound impulse which was studied 10 years after all, independently, 10 years after all of this was discovered. In short, then, there's a remarkable convergence of evidence concerning not just a shot from the knoll from some shadowy corner, but the exact location of a shot from the knoll. The evidence doesn't lead to various locations and to various battles over which location is correct. Rather, it leads to one single unambiguous location. However, perhaps the most intriguing evidence of a shot from the right front is found in the Zapruder film. And I'm not going to show it to you, thankfully. As we all know, when looking at the film at speed, we see something akin to JFK being hit with a baseball bat in the right temple and bowled over backwards and to the left. Back in 1966 and 67, I tried to quantify that movement. Like Ray Marcus before me, I found that what one sees at speed in the film is not one movement, but in fact two movements. That before JFK is bowled over backwards and to the left, his head moves forward. And just yesterday, you saw that Dr. Levy had performed similar measurements on the film and had come to exactly the same conclusion. Next slide, please. Now, what we did, I did exactly the same thing that Dr. Levy did. Here are two fixed points, A and B, on the limousine. I simply measured the distance between point C, which is the back of Kennedy's head, and these 2 points over time. Next slide, please. And what I came up with is this. If you measure from the back seat, you get this graph. If you measure from the handhold, you get this almost identical graph. And notice what you have. You have the head moving forward between 312 and 313, and then moving backwards, the body bounces off the seat and then starts moving forward again. Okay? I mean, this isn't rocket science, but it is something. At least we thought it was something. Next slide. That yields two, then, accelerations, one forward and one backwards. Okay. That's what I believed for some 35 years, 40 years. The upshot of all these measurements, then, is the contention that Kennedy was hit in the head by two bullets, one from the rear and one from the right front, and that both these shots hit their target in less than 1/9 of a second, right? Both hits impacting within 1/9 of a second. Well, I have to tell you, from the very first, I did have a little problem with this thesis, because it seems like a really amazing coincidence that two shots would impact within 1/9 of a second. It just sounds like amazingly coincidental. Doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it sounds like a quite amazing coincidence. I mean, what are the chances that two shooters from different locations would end up placing their shots on a target within 1/9 of a second? Well, it's with great pleasure that now I can say I was wrong. And it seems to me, as I told Dr. Levy yesterday, he's wrong too. Right. Given the very enlightened analysis of David Wimp, I can say that there now is no credible evidence of any forward movement in JFK's head and body caused by a gunshot. The double headshot between 312 and 314, I think, can now be assigned to the ash heap of discredited theories. What remains is overwhelming evidence of a shot from the right front impacting on JFK between 312 and 313. This modification in our knowledge makes it much more likely, in my opinion, that a shot was fired from the location described along the stockade fence at the point indicated. 40 years after the event, scientific evidence is making clear what we could only guess at 35 years ago. The tipping point in this case, I believe, has been the ability to show from the evidence that shots came from more than one direction. The fact that a shot was fired from the grassy knoll and hit JFK in the head is no longer a mere theory. With the very excellent work done by David Wimp and Don Thomas, our next two speakers, I think we can now speak of the grassy knoll shot as virtually a historical fact. So much for the jokes of late-night comedians. Now, David Wimp. Where are you, David Wimp, our hero?
We've been asked to take a 5-minute break, so his
Oh.
PowerPoint could be loaded.
Great. Where's David? Is he here?
I don't know. My assistant told me a few minutes ago we needed to take a 5-minute break so he could.
So we can find David Wimp. Yes, right. Well, I'm a detective. Let me go after him.
While you're searching for David Wimp, I'll make a couple of announcements just for people who may be viewing who don't know. This conference is sponsored by the Assassination Archives and Research Center, co-sponsored by the Cyril Wecht Institute of Law and Forensic Science at Duquesne University and the Committee for an Open Archives. The AARC is a small nonprofit organization located here in D.C., dedicated to obtaining, preserving, and disseminating information on political assassinations. We have a website, aarclibrary.org. which has the 26 volumes of the Warren Commission on it. You can order our sets of CDs, which contain many important documents on the Kennedy assassination. In recent years, we have been obtaining and putting onto CD-ROMs a variety of records, including the Church Committee hearings. Recently, we published a CD-ROM which contains about 12,000 pages of deposition transcripts from the Church Committee that have not been made public. We have the the transcripts of the Clay Shaw conspiracy trial in New Orleans and the grand jury trial transcript. And most importantly, we have a set of 8 CD-ROMs called the Russ Holmes Work Papers or Work File. That's $50,000 of 50,000 pages of CIA records that were made available under the JFK Act. They are records that were compiled by a CIA officer, Russ Holmes, pertaining to the Kennedy assassination. Because they were processed under the JFK Act and not under the Freedom of Information Act, they provide an unprecedented glimpse into the CIA. Those of you who have obtained documents under the FOIA from the CIA are familiar with the problem that many documents are extensively deleted and may be incomprehensible as a result. These records processed under the JFK Act have almost nothing deleted. CIA stations, CIA cryptonyms, CIA officers, the content of the documents are all revealed. They are a fabulous source of information about an agency that has long been shrouded in secrecy. I think it's not a question that has come up here. Is the dinner tonight? We will have a dinner for those who are here who have paid the fee for that dinner. There is a movie to be shown after, a movie on the Warren Commission that is produced and directed by Mark Sobel. It has not yet been publicly released. It has some name Hollywood actors in it, including Martin Sheehan, Joel Don Baker, and Sam Waterston, and others. It will be possible for those who do not attend the dinner to also see that movie. Now, what is David?
Do you have time for questions?
Yeah, well, let's take a couple of questions.
I have a couple of observations.
Sure. You have a microphone that we can bring up here?
I can speak loud.
Okay.
Well, as I've gone over the witness testimony, I've never found a first shot witness testimony to the stockade offense. And Holland himself says first shot was not from the fence. And I was wondering if he would care to comment on that, or maybe I haven't read it thoroughly enough.
Are you directing the question to Tink? Because he's...
I thought that was, where is Tink? Now we have to find the detective.
He's all sleuthing, yeah.
Yeah.
Send a search party out for the detective.
David, did you have your PowerPoint?
Who's that? We found him.
Okay, all right, welcome. David Wimp is a computer scientist who used to work in computer.
I found it. It's right here.
Yes, it's behind me. Yeah. You receive an award, Tink. He's a computer scientist who used to work for a firm now defunct that performed flight simulation tests And he has, as Tink has described, he has done some interesting new studies on the Zapruder film at the time of the headshot. I now give you David Wimp.
Going to take just a moment to get set up here.
I lent you a pointer.
Okay.
Put it there.
Okay. Pick it up. It's all right. Which side? It's going to be away. Yeah. I'll have to be like that. Oh, that's good. Okay. A second.
What's that? There's a second function in that, and then it gives you.
Okay, I guess the first question answered by the last speaker. A lot of people have observed this, and the question is, what makes it happen? See, animations aren't working. Let's try this again.
Close that window. Did you wrap your window open?
What?
Close that window.
Well, I'm not.
Got a bunch of windows open.
I don't know that I'm running this as I should. See, I'm doing this. This is all I know to do. I don't know how to, it's not showing animations. Oh, now it is. Okay. So I've aligned the frames here from 310 to 317. And I believe you can make out that it appears his head goes forward right before it goes back. The way I've aligned this, I've aligned that bright spot on the roll bar that's most in front of JFK's head, the front of it, as you're looking at it, are on the right, I've just sort of centered it vertically. That's not important and for what we're doing, and it makes it easier to watch.
I don't see where that is.
What's that?
You've aligned it with the roll bar.
No, with the, see that, the second spot from the bottom, the second bright spot. Oh, just directly, huh? Okay, there we go. Right there. So that's my alignment point. And what that does is it eliminates parallax, at least for the points directly behind it, which is pretty close to JFK. But then you might ask, why align it that way? I could align it another way. I could have aligned it in the center or on the left. So why should it be lined up that way? And it makes a big difference, too, in what you get as the measurement of his forward motion. Okay. We've got a phenomenon in the human visual system called mock banding. And as you see something that looks like an edge right there. But there really isn't one. This is the intensity graph here. It actually ramps up. You can sort of tell that. And this depends a lot on the display, the characteristics of the display, what it actually looks like. But when you get this, the intensity over here, it's down, it's dark. When you get a ramp up like that, which you get in blurring, up to the broader spot, you tend to see that as an edge. It's kind of fuzzy, but this is happening behind JFK's head in this Zapruder film. And that's what everybody missed. Okay, here's some that show up a little better. You can see like this one. This is really, this white blurred across that black more as that would happen on film. And you see an edge there. And there really isn't one. It's a ramp. It's just a ramp up.
Not clear. What are we seeing? At the top is what?
Oh, this is what you started with. Yeah, I guess there's no explanation. I'm simulating blurring, motion blurring here, where the image is moving during the exposure. So we're saying the blurring is this way, that the camera would actually be moving the opposite way, but that the image is moving this way during the exposure of the film. And so you should see just some kind of ramp up because, see, I'm just moving this across during the exposure. I'm moving this line over to here. So this part over here is all white during the exposure, and then starting here, you get a little bit of black, mostly white, a little bit of black. No, I'm not using the mic, huh? A little black, and then more and more black until you get across. But this is not the sharp edge that it looks like. That's the point. It's a phenomenon called mock banding, where when you have those kind of ramps, the visual system tends to see it as a sharp edge. The others are just showing that the effect is stronger if you have higher contrast in the two areas. I've lowered the contrast, and you see it gets to be less and less of an edge. And over here, it looks more like what it really is, which is just a smooth change, continuous change. And so this is how mock banding can fool you if you're measuring in this Zapruder film. Here I've just taken, this is supposed to be a bright area on the film, dark, bright, and now we've simulated the blurring in that direction during exposure. The film's moving that way, or the image is across the film. And this is idealized, but we're saying that we get that mock band here. This is the transition region, but we get a mock band there. And so that's your result. And as you can see, if you're seeing the bands there, you're getting the actual distance was less than you're measuring. Okay, so ITEC said the head moved forward 2.3 inches. But in fact, does it move that far? That would actually be quite a lot of movement, and I think very hard to explain by any means. To move forward 2.3 inches in 1/18 of a second and then reverse shortly after that. Okay. So, what I'm say iTech did wrong was these are centered, by the way. I picked the center of that spot to be the same in each of the two frames. And that is 2.3 inches, that distance there. I hope somebody can see that. And as you can see, it's about right. That's about what you see happening. Moving forward 2.3 inches. Now, of course, they didn't really do this. They didn't line frames up like this and then measure. But what they did, I think, the best I've been able to figure was something that's equivalent to this, in that they probably took some kind of average back here for the back seat. Like if you see, you watch this, you say, well, where is the front and the back? You can see the front there, and the back gets a little bit wider back here. So if you averaged on one end, but not on the other, because you don't see any reason to average behind his head. It looks like the edge just goes right up to his head. But this is where the mock banding comes in. That you're not really, there's really not a sharp edge. It is a ramp up. And it's just your visual system. And you can find real easily if you've got software that lets you put your cursor on a point and it tells you the color value there. You can just start at the back of his head and move backwards and see that it does decrease in intensity smoothly behind his head. So there's a blur there, you just don't see it. It's blurring, and if you think about it, there's no reason why the film should be blurring everywhere but one place. Excuse me? Oh, I thought I heard a question. Obviously, these spots are getting wider. You can't really tell. You can't see all of that. But if you look around, things are getting wider. The bright areas are getting wider. So it's happening back there, too. Some of that apparent movement is actually motion of the camera, not of his head. Okay?
The whole vehicle appears to be going up.
Oh, well,
is that also because of movement of the camera?
Yes. There's just no way. See, the truth is, you think about, well, what's the position of something in this film, in this frame? If it's blurred, there really isn't one, because everything is moving during the exposure, so there's really a range. There's a starting position and ending position. And so it does appear to be going up.
The back of it is going up relative to the front.
But if you look at that driver's
Well, it will a little bit.
If you look at that driver's head in comparison to that little grass mound above it, you'll find out that actually the car is not going up.
Well, the slope of this curve changes as the camera moves. And the camera moves quite a bit between these two frames, relatively speaking. But if you, well, that's just the way pictures work. If you pan the camera across that curve.
If you just look at the line at the bottom of the vehicle, there's no question that the angle.
Oh yeah, but the camera. See, that's showing.
That's the camera.
That's right. Oh, I'm sorry. I see what you're saying.
That's
Yes.
what I'm
Oh,
saying.
I'm sorry. Yes, you can see the camera motion from watching what happened to the frame here.
But that contributes to the look that he's going forward, I think.
Well, you can't really see. There's not up there to see that it's moving horizontally too. As a matter of fact, some of the slope changes. There's a little bit of rotation change, but yes.
Is Conway's head also moving forward, and is it doing so for the same reason?
Well, I will be getting to that. That very issue, yes. And if you see, if you notice, if I had a way to get back without starting over, you could see that everybody's head appears to be moving forward now more than it did in the other alignment. And of course, the frame's been slid farther forward for 313 because I was aligning it at the right edge before, and now they're centered. So yes, the whole frame is slid over in this alignment a bit. But yeah, everybody's head goes forward. Excuse me?
Doesn't
Oh, yes. Well, there's something right there that we can't really identify. A lot of spray, and that's definitely over his head. But yes, his head does move relative to hers, and that is something you can do, is measure the relative motions. And
Both
that-
the men's heads move relative to the
Yes, they do. And if you really want to pick the guy that's the best bellwether, it's Kellerman here, but you can't really see it until the next frame. The back of his head's pretty murky. So this would be the same as if you took an average of, say, the spot. You weren't measuring a single point, you were measuring the front and back and taking an average, which would be equivalent to doing the same with another reference like the back seat. So that way you would get something like 2.3 inches of forward motion. And I believe that's how they got it. Excuse me?
A simple question.
Okay.
It's staring me. I mean, his head is moving 2.3 inches. Nobody else's head is moving 2.3. In fact,
Well,
I think you can conclude that Connolly, Lady Bird, Connolly's wife, Nellie Connolly, is not moving. Is not moving at all. If you look, if you compare it to any fixed structure on the car, it's Connolly's head that might be. Connolly's head is not moving. It's Nellie Connolly whose head is moving back, and you can look at any fixed structure on the car and you can see that. So the only head that's moving forward is Kennedy.
Well, I got some frames coming up here that will show, and you got to also notice these people aren't all sitting the same, and they aren't all braced the same. So that might be one reason, if the motion is something other than getting shot, why they aren't all moving the same. Well, all right. And I just aligned it by the left. Looks like that one's not going to run. Well, anyway, if you align it on the left edges, he moves even more. That was all I was going to show. Okay. Now here I've aligned the right edge instead of the center.
Looks like Jackie's moving backwards.
Well, you've got, the problem is that in a blurred frame like this, you can't line it up to see everything.
Well, you can still see
Yeah.
that hat that she wore, it's moving backwards.
Look at the forward edge.
Now look at the cap right there, freeze it.
Right. Yeah, this edge
Can you
moves
freeze the
forward.
frame?
No, I can't.
If you freeze it, when you freeze it, you're going to see her head, the pillbox hat she has on, and then when you take the explosion, she goes backward.
Well, no, the back edge does. See, I've got it on the front edge.
Backward.
Look, the front edge doesn't move.
Oh, no, you can see her.
The back edge does.
It appears to move because his head's moving.
No, it appears to move because of the blurring. See, look, the back edge here is moving too. The back edge of that bright
Look at
spot.
the inside handle. The inside handle. If you freeze it, you see the silver inside handle. Just looking at it, now watch where it moves. It goes backwards.
The back of her head does.
No, the handle. The handle.
The handle?
Watch it.
Yeah, look, everything does. It's blurring. Everything's getting wider, so if you line one edge, the other edge can't be aligned.
How the hell can they be going forward? She going backwards.
Well, she isn't going backwards. If you measure from the right edges of things, she doesn't go backwards. Excuse me. Yes.
It also looks to me as if Jackie's right hand might be on his back, and I can see her elbow move, and it almost looks as if
Well-
she might be pushing him forward.
Well, her elbow is actually moving, and if you watch the sequence, you can see that her arm is moving during this time, although I think she may collide with him just after this. I'm pretty sure she hasn't yet.
Do we know
You can
from
see,
the other side where
you
her
can see
hand
in the
is?
Nix film, you can see pretty well see in the Nix film that it hasn't touched him yet, but it may right after that. So if you line them this way, you get about an inch. Looks like a little bit more in this alignment. But that's an inch right there. So, the question for which is right is, it depends on what you're looking at, what you want to see. And the trick is that if you're looking at something that has, say, bright on the left and dark on the right, as that edge behind his head did, then you need to measure from something that has the same characteristics. It's got the light and dark parts on the same sides. If you don't, you get camera motion included in your measurement. You want the blurring all to be going the same. Basically, you want the blurring to be all going the same way. And for the parts that you're trying to measure. Okay. Actually, now we have a chance to two films to measure the limo motion in, and the Zapruder film would probably be better, except that there's gaps in it, and you can't. There's parts where there's absolutely no background references, and so you just get segments of motion. You have gaps in your measurements. But in the next film, at least you get a measurement in every frame, but then the camera's a lot farther off. The camera's a couple hundred feet from the car, so the resolution isn't very good. But nevertheless, I proceeded to do it anyway, and first, of course, got to determine Nix's location, and then the way I did it, I pointed the camera, I transformed the frame so the camera is pointed in the same direction in every frame. And I first did it from the background, just from objects in the frames, which I knew the locations of. But then once you've got the frames nearly aligned, you can use the frames themselves to further align it, because they have common points in them that you may not know the location of, but you just need to know their direction, and you can determine that once you have the camera pointing correctly. And so then for each measurement of the limo, I just made a 3D vector, and I have a plane representing the limo's path. It's an idealized plane. It probably isn't traveling in exactly a straight line. And then so I projected the vectors onto the plane, and that gives me a path, or at least that point on the limo, along the plane. And I've actually, well, I can see the aspect ratio is off here, but as a byproduct, you get a stabilized Nix sequence. That's not supposed to be so high. So you can see it's pretty stable. So, and this actually reflects the directions that I had the camera pointed for in the measurements, in the final result. So here's where I have Nix. Well, you can just barely see it. That's the path of the car during that sequence. And this would be his approximate view at some point. Yeah. That's just another shot of the model. That would be Nix's view of the model I was using. Okay, so here are the measurements. And as you can see, they're pretty noisy. This might could be improved some, I'm not sure, but there's not a lot of resolution in those frames. The car's a long way off. It's not moving, and this stuff in here is a pixel difference between these points and these points. That's why it's bouncing up and down. Most of it is just quantization error. You only have about 12 pixels difference between each frame. So anyway, you smooth it so you can look at it. Now, I doubt this is real. This is probably more of that pixelation stuff. But you see, it looks generally like the limo. Yeah, the limo's slowing down. This starts at about 292, roughly, as a Zapruder equivalent. The limo does seem generally to slow down. The headshot occurs right in here somewhere. 21 is the headshot. And then, at some point, it seems maybe to level out. Okay, so you can't do a whole lot with this data, so I just took segments of it that I had some reason to believe were fairly constant and fit them with just quadratic polynomials, which most of you have heard of. About the simplest fit you can get other than just a line. And then I put them together. I actually did 3 different fits. Fit 1 through 20, this would be up nearly to the headshot, and it's showing a constant deceleration here, but that's just because that's all a quadratic can do. This is the best it can show you. This would be the velocity, and it has it coming in at like about 9.6 miles per hour, and then it slowed down to, at least in this fit, a little below 8 miles an hour at the time of the headshot. And then I think this range would be about 7 frames after the headshot. And the scale isn't the same. That might have looked steeper than the last line, but it's about the same. I'll put them together here in a minute. So it shows it decelerating even more after the headshot. And then this would be approximately Zapruder 320 through 331. And now the limo's accelerating. But it's not accelerating very fast. And this slope here is about 0.035 Gs. And the reason I find this very interesting is I got a very similar result in the Zapruder film. And a limo coasting without any throttle or brake or any resistance or friction would coast down the hill at 0.055 Gs. So that's something like you would expect, at least I would expect, that limo to be coasting, just with no gas, no brake. He's just coasting down the hill. And it's been suggested that the limo slowed down because the driver let off the gas. And my own experience with automatics, if you're on a 3-degree slope and you're going 12 miles an hour, I've tried this with a few cars, and you give it no brake and no throttle, you're going to gradually accelerate. An automatic is not going to abruptly slow down, at least in drive, if you let off the gas under those conditions. So I believe that at this point, in this stretch here, the limo is in fact just coasting, and that it must have been braking that slowed the limo down. Okay, well here I put the 3 segments together, and somehow they matched up here, but not quite here, but that's just the uncertainty of the data. But generally we get a downslope, a decreasing velocity up into somewhere in this range. This scale is seconds now. But somewhere it reverses and starts accelerating again. All right, what I would conclude is that Greer was braking before the headshot. That's why the car was slowing down. And we're not going to get a real good look at exactly how that braking occurred, at least not in the measurements I've been able to make so far. But then, from 320 on to some point where he hits the accelerator, he's actually coasting. Oops, a little spelling error there. He's actually coasting, and that's why he's slightly accelerating. So, now here's the sequence I promised you earlier. This is 311 through 315 just in a loop. And this is a guy that I find most interesting, Kellerman in the front seat. You notice Connolly and Kellerman, they're both starting forward. Right about the same time, maybe not exactly. And the question is the limo braking causing this? I think probably so, but they're not all moving. If you look real closely, you can't pick up their forward movement at the same time. But you have to remember that the effect of limo braking, the force that actually acts on you is wherever you're in contact with a limo. And the force has to be transmitted through your body up to your head, because it's actually acting. If you're sitting down, it's acting on your posterior. It's like somebody grabs you by the seat and is pulling you back. So there may be more lag time, depending on how tense the back is, perhaps other factors. Connolly is actually lying sideways, and he's more or less rolling forward. And Kellerman was actually just straightening up right before this happened. So he may, in fact, be accelerating forward but he's still moving backwards. You know, he doesn't just instantly reverse direction. He just starts, his backward motion starts to slow down. There's not enough here to see that. As a matter of fact, let's see if I can get back and, oops, guess not. All right, let me get, I guess there wasn't enough in this one either. I had to cut some of these down because they weren't playing right. I guess I didn't get 308. If you go back a couple of more frames, you can see that Kellerman was actually leaned forward just before this, and it just straightened out, just about gotten vertical again.
And then went forward after that?
Yes. He was actually leaned way forward. His head was probably in there somewhere. I'm not sure if he was leaned over to talk on the microphone. I don't think I got enough. Yeah, I couldn't get a large enough animation to work in here to really see what's happening with his arm. But if you've ever noticed, JFK's arm also moves up right after the shot. It moves up and down in about half a second. And I believe that by the principle of equivalence in physics, if something is accelerating, then it's just as if there were gravity acting on it. If you're in a spaceship out in deep space where there's no gravity, accelerating at 32 feet per second, which is the acceleration due to gravity, you can't tell if it's closed. You can't tell if you're in a spaceship out in space accelerating or on Earth sitting still. And so if JFK is accelerating to his left, that would have the same effect as if he were hanging on his side and his arm was acting as a pendulum. And unfortunately, I couldn't get those animations to work that show that. We can see. You can just see it starting up. It pops on up about 3 inches and then comes immediately back down. You know what? I could just kill this and run it directly, yeah. Right, the animation shot.
You can minimize that thing in the middle if you want.
Okay. It's not going to be easy. Well, I'd have to dig through and find it. I don't think I can find it up here. So, are there any questions? Yes?
When I worked for the House Assassinations Committee, we sent a lot of this stuff to JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California, and they had a really terrific image deblurring program. I was wondering whether 313, subjected to an image deblurring program, might give you better frames of reference.
You know, the problem with deblurring is you have to assume something about the blurring to actually run it. And one of the real big problems in 313 is there's two motions. JFK's moving and the limo's moving. And they combine vectorially, and there's not any real way to, there's enough there to deblur the limo.
That's what I meant.
Yeah.
If you deblur the stabilized image of the
limo,
would it not give you a better frame of reference to where the president is in reality?
Well, yeah, except you can do the same thing by aligning the blurs. But see, by doing that, you will have aligned the blurs one way or another. So, and the problem with his head is there's two blurrings there, so it's not going to give you back anything. I mean, there's going to be artifacts there. in his head because his head was moving independently of the car, and you're de-blurring it as if it were just moving like the car. So that's not going to really come out right. Yes?
The mix analysis that you did for the velocity of the car obviously is not very precise, but it shows a relatively constant rate of deceleration. And
well,
this forward motion is in one particular spot, and I'm wondering how you...
Well, the analysis I did could only show a constant acceleration. If it was a quadratic, that's all it can show. And I'm...
spot though, I guess.
It's just not, there's not enough resolution, I don't think. You can resolve a short pulse of braking, which is what it would have to be. Yes.
Would you restate what you say that we are seeing there? What are we seeing?
I believe that Greer was on the brake and that either he clipped it at the end. And the question is, why would he brake as well? Would he be intentionally braking there, or was it all an accident? And I suspect it might have been an accident. He might have been, in fact, going for the accelerator. But I think that there was some sort of pulse of braking there. It wasn't even, it wasn't even braking. Maybe he went for the accelerator right at the end and just clipped the edge of it, gave it a little pulse. I've done that myself.
Like that guy in Santa Monica that ran over 80 people, hit the wrong guy.
David, would you summarize basically in terms of Zapruder film what you find? In other words, starting at 308 or whatever it is, you see all of these people actually moving forward in the limousine?
Only at starting right about the headshot. They're not moving. Well, Kellerman...
Kennedy moving forward?
No, I don't see any motion that I can absolutely verify for JFK prior to the headshot. But there could be some. Yes.
Mr. Wimp, on that, does Greer brake before the headshot, after the headshot, or simultaneously with the headshot? Because we have this testimony both at the Warrant Commission and the House Select Committee that he turns all the way around, looks at the president, the headshot, then he accelerated. But prior to that, somewhere between 11.1, 11.3 miles per hour, all the major investigations said the speed was consistent with that until after the headshot, the third shot, and then he accelerates. Are you suggesting?
Oh, no, it definitely slows down. I think that almost anybody who's measured has found that it slowed down from 12 miles an hour before the headshot. I think Alvarez had it slowing down somewhere like 298 to 310. But actually, if you do the math for what he called for, that's a pretty sharp braking. That's almost 0.4 Gs. You should see people flying forward.
Prior to the headshot simultaneously, or?
Oh, no, he is braking before the headshot. He slows down. The limo slows down well before the headshot.
He turns around and looks in the back.
But what I'm postulating is that there's an extra pulse of braking in there right about the headshot. This is light braking, by the way.
And what you're postulating is that there really is no forward movement from 313 to 314, that movement, Kennedy's apparent movement, is consistent with the movement of the other limousine occupants,
right.
And it's not a function of the shot,
right.
It's a function of a consistent pattern of forward movement as he touches the brake.
Right.
Would that be a way of restating?
Exactly. And there's one thing I did fail to mention, that you can't really say when this motion occurs. At 312, there's no headshot, and he hasn't moved forward, and then at 313, he's been shot and he's moved forward. And so you can't really resolve those two events, which came first. So, it's possible he did move forward before he was shot.
But everybody else has also moved forward in that frame as well, right?
Well, you really don't pick them up moving in that frame. It's the next frame Connolly you do. See, is that little twist of his head there? Is that from braking?
It looks like Kellerman is too.
No, if you break it down real slowly, you really see him moving from 314 on, but he was moving back before, and back of his head gets back against that window frame, and it's really hard to tell what's happening. So he may well be, and he may well be not really moving forward. He's just not moving back as fast as he would have been.
Question.
Yeah.
I missed
connection between the mock band phenomena and your talk? What was the point of that?
Well, that the measurement of 2.3 inches, well, if you measure, first of all, if you measure with your eyeballs, you're pretty well depending on mock banding.
Why don't you mention the white mock band then? Rather, why do you only concentrate on the dark mock band? Which, of course, is in favor of your thesis to the front where you're claiming illusion is, but theoretically there's a white mock band as well.
Well,
and in natural images, you don't get mock bands. What you get are real edges. And particularly at this spatial frequency, because their receptive fields are much smaller.
well, I tell you, there is no edge there at the back of JFK's head. You can find that out yourself.
It's an edge. It's just a gradient edge. That's
It's a gradient.
Yeah, and what the system does is resolves it on a medium line, not to the right as you suggest. You picked the dark mock band and suggested it's giving you an illusion.
Well,
you've left out the light mock band.
Well, I don't believe that iTech took mock banding into account. Is what I'm saying.
It cancels itself out, sir. That's my point.
No, it doesn't.
Absolutely, it does.
Well, if you measure both sides of it, but I doubt that they looked at the ramp behind JFK's head. Is what I'm saying. I think they probably just saw that edge at the front, right behind his head.
You don't get mock bands on dynamic edges anyway. You don't get them at the spatial frequency.
Well,
I mean, they're key to the size of the receptive fields in the visual system. You can't get them under these circumstances.
well, maybe it's not really mock banding, but there is an illusion of an edge there where there's really a ramp.
Visually, an edge is defined as a ramp. It's either steep or not, and therefore, if it's a slow ramp, then it's a blurry edge. If it's a sharp ramp, then it's a sharp edge. And so your language is off. It doesn't make any sense.
It's a blurry ramp. Yes, it is a blurry
It's a
ramp.
blurry edge, which is a ramp.
Right. Okay, well, whether or not it has to do with mock banding, I believe the problem is that they did some kind of averaging on one end and not on the other. At least you get the same results. Yeah.
David, do you think it's possible that JFK may be reacting to the braking more than perhaps anyone else in the car other than Kellerman because of the back brace? Do you think that could be an issue in understanding the movements here?
I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, if his back was more rigid, it could be, yeah. I suppose. I don't know. I don't think through the physics of that. Okay, I'm sorry. All right, sounds like I'm out of time. So this gets passed on. Thank you.
Almost 3.5 years ago, Science and Justice, the journal of the British Forensic Science Society, published a study by Dr. Don Thomas on the acoustics evidence. Dr. Thomas reviewed the work of the two panels of the House Select Committee that were the basis for the House Committee's stunning repudiation of the Warren Report and its finding that there was a high degree of probability that Kennedy had been murdered by a conspiracy. At the end of its work, the House Select Committee turned that lead on the acoustics evidence over the Department of Justice, which farmed it out to the National Academy of Sciences. A panel headed by Dr. Norman Ramsey of Harvard University then issued a report dismissing the work of the House panels. 3.5 years ago, Dr. Thomas issued his report finding fault with both of the prior reports, but substantiating the claim of the House Select Committee that there was a fourth shot from the grassy knoll, with even higher degree of probability than that the committee had assigned to it. Despite this stunning revelation, to my knowledge, neither the Department of Justice nor Congress has taken an interest in this. Perhaps we can someday force them to do so. Dr. Thomas will now explain the basis for his conclusions.
Thank you, Jim. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to speak to you. According to the Warren Commission, there was no more, no less than exactly 3 shots fired at President Kennedy during the assassination, all by Lee Harvey Oswald from a position in a building behind the president. As we've heard from some of our speakers, that conclusion was not in very good accord with the evidence available to the Warren Commission. Firstly, the Warren report states that some witnesses had identified an area in front of the president as a source of the shots. Actually, it was the majority of the witnesses who were interviewed by the Warren Commission or its minions thought that gunfire had come from that location. Secondly, as we have seen, the Zapruder film shows that the president's head was knocked backwards by the impact of the shot, which is cogent evidence for a gunshot from the front. The Warren report states, and I quote, 3 shots were heard and the president fell forward back, bleeding from the head, which turns out to be the exact opposite of the truth. And thirdly, inasmuch as there were at least 4 wounds inflicted on the victims of the shooting, the 3-shot scenario just doesn't seem to add up. In 1978, the House Select Committee on Assassinations developed acoustical evidence for a gunshot from the grassy knoll, and that's what I'm going to try to explain. I'm not going forward with this. There, okay. On the day that President Kennedy was assassinated, the Dallas police were communicating over 2 radio channels. They designated those simply as Channel 1 and Channel 2. Channel 1 was the primary channel used for routine police transmissions. It was being recorded at headquarters on a dictabelt machine like the one shown here on the left. Channel 2, an auxiliary channel, was dedicated on this day to the police escort with the president's motorcade. It was being recorded on a gray autograph disc recorder like the one shown here on the right. It is by the context of the broadcast on Channel 2 that we can establish and fix the time of the assassination. And I want to play that for you. I'll start with that. Before I do, I need to introduce you to someone. This is Chief of Police Jesse Curry, and the voice you will hear is his. He was in the lead car, the pace car, if you will, of the motorcade. This photograph shows the president's limousine entering Dealey Plaza, and in the distance, about 200 feet in front of him, you see the lead car with the Chief of Police. And now, I've prepared this transcript so you can actually follow along with the broadcast. I'm not getting an arrow here. Oop. There we go. Sound a little spastic here, so how do you Rex. What, enter? I am. The critical part of that broadcast, of course, was the last Chief Curry ordering the motorcade to head to the hospital. So the shooting has occurred. He knows the president's been shot. Just 10 seconds before that broadcast, you heard the dispatcher, as a regular part of protocol, announce the time as 12:30. He also announced the time 12:31, 12:32, etc. So that establishes the time at approximately 12:30 by the dispatcher's clock. And just 10 seconds before the dispatcher announced 12:30, Curry had announced that he was at the Triple Underpass. If you're not familiar with Dealey Plaza, I can't imagine somebody's here who's not. The Triple Underpass is that railroad bridge to the left and the three roads that go underneath it. This is the pointer. If Curry is here at the Triple Underpass, then President Kennedy, about 200 feet behind him, is in the midsection of Elm Street, and that's exactly where the shooting occurred. Hence, the broadcast where Chief Curry says he's at the Triple Underpass, that's probably the broadcast by context which is the closest to the actual time of the shooting. This here is the grassy knoll. This is the book depository where Lee Harvey Oswald was an employee. At a most unusual event over on Channel 1, and a fortuitous event as it turns out, happened for 5.5 minutes beginning around 12:28 until around 12:34, again by the dispatcher's time notations. Somewhere in Dallas, a microphone on a police motorcycle becomes stuck open, and Channel 1 is dominated by the sound of that motorcycle motor. He is effectively then blocking, jamming the transmissions on Channel 1. Well, this is real slow to come up here, this arrow. There you go. Where? In the middle? Yeah. Oh, that pad. That I see this. Gotcha. Well, a key question here is what made the dispatcher so certain that the motorcycle was on the Stemmons Freeway. Now, the most likely piece of evidence was the fact that 1 minute earlier you can hear sirens in the background behind that motorcycle motor noise. The one emergency that was going on was the President's motorcade on its way to Parkland Hospital on the Stemmons Freeway. So the dispatcher had made the inference that it must be one of the motorcycles with the motorcade. There were 18 motorcycles assigned to the President's motorcade. If so, then there's a chance that that motorcycle was in Dealey Plaza, and if so, it might have captured the sounds of the gunshots on its microphone and recorded it at headquarters. And if so, then we would have direct evidence relative to the problem of exactly how many shots were fired during the Kennedy assassination. So in 1978, the House Select Committee on Assassinations arranged for an expert analysis of the Dallas police tapes. They chose a firm, actually, they went to the Acoustical Society of America, who recommended to them a firm of Bolt, Baranek, and Newman of Cambridge, Massachusetts. They had done the Kent State shooting tapes back in mid-70s. In that case, National Guard soldiers had fired at some rowdy students. Later, the National Guard would claim that they were returning fire, that they had been fired at first. So BBN analyzed, there was a video and an audio tape. They analyzed the sounds, used triangulation to identify the origin of the sounds, the first 3 gunshot sounds, and found not only the soldiers that fired the first 3 shots, but were able to identify the precise 3 soldiers who had fired the shots. And subsequently, from the films, that the FBI were able to identify these individuals and interviewed them, and all 3 admitted that they had, in fact, discharged their weapons. So the same experts were asked to apply the same technology to the police tapes. I just want to give you a very brief primer on what it is that the acoustical experts were looking for. Sound is a change in air pressure, and it is caused when something causes air to become compressed, the molecules closer together, and as a consequence you also have rarefaction of the molecules, so that a sound wave is a lot like an ocean wave. It has a crest and a trough. And you can actually see that in this shadow graph of a bullet making a sound wave in a smoke chamber, so that the air becomes compressed here, and you can actually see the compression of the air. That's your sound wave, that's your crest, and right behind it you see the white, the lighter color, that's your trough of the sound, because the air molecule has been compressed into that wave. And when that strikes your ear, that's the sound that you hear. Now, some folks might think that the sound that a rifle makes is caused by the detonation of the cartridge, of the powder, but actually it's the bullet that makes the noise. When the bullet travels from the chamber to the muzzle, it forces that column of air in the barrel to collide violently with the air in front of the muzzle, and that's what generates the sound. That's called a muzzle blast. Now, the characteristics of a gunshot, it doesn't have a characteristic frequency because it's a single impulse. The characteristics of a gunshot is that it's very, very loud, very, very brief. The problem with loudness is that it's a factor both of the intrinsic energy that goes into making the sound, but also the distance, which is to say that a gunshot's very loud if you're standing near the man with the gun, but if you're a half a mile away, then it's not very loud. Conversely, if I clap my hands right next to your ear, well, that's a sudden loud noise. And the problem then is, if you find a sudden loud noise on a recording, is that because it was an intrinsically loud noise, or is it simply something that happened to be close to the microphone? Well, the answer to that is that a clap of my hands is not going to resonate off of a building 300 feet away and come back as a loud echo, but an intrinsically loud sound like a gunshot will. Now, an echo is a reflection, and you know that it's a mirror image. So it's just like if you're in the canyon and you're shouting, "Hello, hello," you can hear the same word. Not only the word can you make out, your voice can be distinguished from somebody else's voice because the timbre, everything is reflected. It's a mirror image. Well, just as that muzzle blast will be a large, narrow impulse, the echoes will also be large, narrow impulses. And so in an urban environment like downtown Dallas, where you've got these buildings, you should have a cluster or train of large, narrow impulses, and that's what a gunshot is expected to look like. So that is what, something like this, is what the experts were looking for, this being the original muzzle blast, and then there should be a train of echoes after it. That's what they're looking for on the police tape. So they process the police tape through an oscillograph, and this is what you find. Basically, this is mostly motorcycle noise, and rising above the motorcycle noise, you've got these trains of large, narrow impulses. That's what a gunshot would look like, but then a lot of other things might look like that. Static might look like that. So they had to make some additional criteria for screening the 5.5 minutes of recording. So these are the 4 characteristics, the criteria they used. Now, in each impulse pattern should be around 10 impulses, and that's because you've got 5 large buildings facing the plaza, and you'll get an impulse off a reflection off the face of the building, but you'll also get a refraction off the corner of each building. So there should be around 10 impulses, but the exact number is going to vary a little bit depending on exactly where the microphone is relative to the buildings. So you're looking for patterns about 10 impulses. Each pattern should be a quarter to a half second duration, and that's from simply the physical dimensions of Dealey Plaza being 500 feet across, speed of sound 1,100 feet per second. It shouldn't take more than about a half a second for sound to travel across that plaza. There should be at least 3 discrete patterns, because we all agree that there's at least 3 shots during the assassination. The question is, was there more? The total sequence of gunfire should be at least 4.5 seconds, but less than 15 seconds. The 15 seconds, the upper limit, comes from the filmed evidence that the president's limousine was only on Elm Street for about 15 seconds. The 4.5 seconds comes from the function of Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle. The U.S. Army Weapons Testing Branch established that the cycle time, that is, the time to fire it, reload, and fire again, was 2.25 seconds. So to get 3 shots, you need at least 4.5 seconds. So applying those 4 criteria to the entire 5.5 minutes of recording, they find only one place that meets all those criteria, and it happens in a 10-second sequence that begins about 136 seconds into the motorcycle segment. So the next step was to go to Dealey Plaza and actually fire test shots, record those test shots, so now we know exactly what a Dealey Plaza echo pattern looks like, and compare that to the sounds patterns that are on the police tape. The one on the bottom is the patterns that I'd shown you earlier from the police recording. The upper figure shows an oscillograph of the test shot fired from the grassy knoll. Now, to the untrained eye, you'd look at those and say they don't look anything alike. There's a reason for that. The upper recording is a high-fidelity recording. And as I explained, as sound travels over distance, it diminishes in amplitude. And so you will have echoes coming from further away will be smaller. The police tape, on the other hand, is not a high-fidelity recording at all. It had built into its circuitry something called automatic gain control, which was a sort of automatic volume control. It was necessary to enhance voice communications because here you've got 100 police officers or so, and they're all at different distances. They all have different signal strengths. And the automatic gain control compressed the sound levels, it amplified the weak signals, and it diminished the very strong signals so that everybody was able to talk at about the same level, just compressing it into a comfort zone so that no one was having to constantly adjust the volume. As a consequence, it had a very fast attack time, and so it would expectedly diminish the big signals and amplify the small signals. So we can't rely on amplitude. The comparison that the acoustical experts made was strictly on the arrival time, the echo delay time. And when they did that, they found they indeed matched to the test shots. Which brings us to the key question of how many shots did they find? The House Select Committee on Assassinations report states 4 shots. But that's not what the acoustical experts found. The acoustical experts found 5, which is to say that there are 5 sound patterns on the police tape which matched to test shots that were fired in Dealey Plaza. And the question is, why, if the acoustical experts found 5, why did the House Select Committee report only 4? Well, I spoke to, this is what they say in their report. It says that the entry in Table 2, and this is in reference to those sound patterns, their arrival time on the recording. It said that the rifle couldn't be fired that rapidly. There were 2 shots too close together, and therefore it must be a false alarm or false positive. And this is equivalent of saying if Lee Harvey Oswald didn't shoot it, it's not a shot. So the fact is that they did find 5 patterns that matched to that was tacky, I know.
Oh, that wasn't the real recording?
That is not the recording. Good point. That is not the recording. The sound on the recording itself sounds like Rice Krispies. It's just snap, crackle, pop. And if it sounded like that, you wouldn't need acoustical experts to tell you how many shots are on the recording. The point here is that the sequence, if the acoustical evidence is correct, that is the sequence that is on the tape. That's the spread of the shots. 3 close together, then about a 5-second gap or interval, and then 2 shots close together. So how do we know we didn't get just the false positives here, that these matches are not just spurious? Because of the controversial nature of that finding by the acoustical experts, the House Select Committee then went to a second laboratory, again recommended to them by the Acoustical Society of America. They went to the Computer Science Department at Queens College in New York. These folks were experts in sonar. In fact, they're the folks that write the computer programs for our submarines, which is this same principle that we're using here. Echolocation is a form of triangulation. If you know, the principle being, if you know 2 angles of your triangle and you know something about the distance, then you can solve for the third point. And in this case, we know the distance comes from that echo delay time. Basically, this is applying that triangulation to Dealey Plaza. And the result was that the acoustical experts found that the shot that matched to the grassy knoll, their triangulation pinpointed it to a spot actually about 10 feet from the corner, plus or minus 5 feet, which puts it right near this this spot right here. If you walk up to the fence and look over, this is the view that you have, and you can see down here, this spot is painted in the street is where President Kennedy was struck in the head. Now, if these, one way to test our hypothesis that that the match means that we've got the gunshots killed President Kennedy, I did a formal statistical analysis. This is what was published by Science and Justice of the odds that this could have happened by chance, that it's something that's not a gunshot, not an echo pattern of a gunshot. If it was anything else like static, there should be a likelihood that it would happen. As it turns out, the odds are about 100,000 to 1 against it having a random pattern match to the patterns as they did. Another way of looking at this to see if they're spurious, if we assume that there was a higher order of chance of that happening, and you got, as we did, 5 matches, then they should occur in random order. And what I'm talking about is because the acoustic experts didn't know exactly where the motorcycle was, they had to array microphones in the plaza along the street, along the route of the motorcade. So they put 36 microphones about 18 feet apart along the route. Now, if these sounds are not echo patterns of gunshots in Dealey Plaza and the match is spurious, then the likelihood of getting a match, say, at this microphone is the same as at this microphone, because it's got nothing to do with Dealey Plaza. And therefore, if you match 5, if it's spurious, they'll be in random order. They'll be in nonsense order. And that's not what happened. They are ordered, which is to say that the first sound on the Dallas police tape matched to this microphone here, a test shot fired at that microphone. The second pattern on the Dallas police tape, second and a half later, matched to this microphone here, test shot recorded there. The third one here, and then down the road here, fourth and fifth one here. So they were exactly in the right order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 125 ways that you can order 5 numbers, only one of which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But it's not just the order, it's the, you'll notice the spacing. There's 3 shots, 3 close together, microphone positions close together, and then 2 further down the road. So that matches the spacing on the recording. And it's not just the spacing, it's the trajectory. The distance from this microphone to this microphone was 130 feet. The time between the first sound and the last sound on the police tape is 8.3 seconds. In order to go 130 feet in 8.3 seconds, you'd have to go approximately 11 miles per hour. And of course, the FBI had shown that the president's limousine was moving at approximately, 11.3 miles per hour is the average speed they calculated. So it was this order in the data, not just the matching, that led the acoustical expert to conclude that yes, they had found the gunshots that killed President Kennedy on the recording. We can test it further. Now that we have identified where these acoustical positions are, we can test that by looking at the film evidence to see if indeed there was a motorcycle at the places predicted by the President's, by this evidence, the acoustical evidence. This picture here was taken in between that, well, the shooting has begun. Clearly the shooting has begun. This is equivalent about Zapruder frame 255. If you look back into the distance here, you'll see no motorcycle, at least for the next 100 feet or so. The acoustical evidence places a motorcycle about 150 feet behind the President's limousine. So if he's there, he should be back over in here just out of sight. The President was the second car. This is the third, the fourth, the fifth car. The motorcycle should be around the seventh car in the motorcade if he was there, according to the acoustical evidence. This next picture, taken about 8 seconds before that picture, we see that's that fifth car in the motorcade, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We find a man on a motorcycle here. This is an officer named McLean. And this picture was taken approximately 5 seconds before the first shot. So to get to the first acoustical position, which is round over in here, it's about 180 feet away. He's got to go between about 25 and 30 miles per hour. And if he does that, which is much faster than the motorcade, he will arrive at the right spot. And did he go faster than the motorcade? This picture was taken about 25 seconds after the shooting, and that's that same officer. There's McLean. This is to orient you. This is an officer named Corson. Here's Bobby Hargis, who had stopped his motorcycle, run up here, then remembered, yeah, you're supposed to go to the hospital, so he ran back to his motorcycle. And that helps you orient for this next picture. This was a picture taken from the 10th car in the motorcade. Here's McLean, here's Corson. This is about 3 or 4 seconds earlier. Here's Hargis starting running towards his motorcycle. What this picture shows you, since it was taken from the 10th car in the motorcade, now remember McLean was behind the 10th car at the motorcade back at the intersection of Houston and Maine. So he has passed at least the 10th, 9th, and 8th cars. He's passed all these, so he's going faster than the motorcade, at least his average speed over that time. In fact, he's gone about 400 feet in the time it's taken this car to go about 200 feet. Now, there's been some stopping and slowing down among these cars, so it isn't definitive, but he has passed up these cars at some point. It looks like he did pass them back on Houston Street. To summarize this evidence, these are the locations where the motorcycle has to have been for the acoustical evidence to be correct. Gary Mack especially has searched the archives for photographic evidence, and we've not been able to find any definitive pictures that show the motorcycle here or not here. There's no pictures of these spots at precisely the right time. So what we've seen is that the motorcycle was here about 5 seconds before the shooting. He was here about 20 seconds after the shooting. We have a further constraint, and that is on the recording itself. You hear the motor humming along until about 2 seconds before the first shot. At that point, the motorcycle noise drops by 75%, which indicates that he's let off the accelerator. We think because he's anticipating making his turn at the corner. He then idles for about 30 seconds, which means we require that he goes faster here than after the shooting. So if we assume that he went 25 to 30 miles per hour here, slowed to about 15 miles per here, slowed idling now, slowing down to about 5 miles per hour here, which therefore meets the requirement that he's traveling about 11 miles per hour between those 2 points, and then continues to idle here at about 5 miles per hour, then he will be at just the right spots, which the filmed evidence shows he was at. No other motorcycle in the motorcade could have been at the right place at the right time. Subsequently, McLean was interviewed, and he stated that he did have a problem with a microphone that would stick open. If the acoustical matches are not the gunshots, then there's no reason for them to occur at the time, exactly at the time of the assassination, in that 5.5 minutes. In other words, what we're saying is, remember we've got 2 separate recordings. On channel 1 we have the sounds, which the acoustical experts have identified as the gunshots. Over on channel 2 we have that broadcast by Chief Curry where he says he's at the triple underpass, which should be the broadcast closest to the time of the shooting. If these are the gunshots that killed President Kennedy, those should be simultaneous. So what we need is somewhere on the recording, we need a simulcast so that we can correlate those two events, see if they're synchronous or not. It turns out there's no less than 5 different simulcasts, broadcasts that are common to both channels. And so it ought to be easy to synchronize things. But as it turns out, as you see here, if it were true that you could rely on these to synchronize events, then each of these events should be separated by the same amount of time. And as you can see here, they're not. They're all different. The reason for that is because one of the reasons, there's several reasons, one of the reasons is that the recordings were sound actuated. In order to save time on the recordings, whenever there was dead air, they'd stop recording. So, and then when somebody would broadcast, it was sound actuated to start recording again. So it's not real time on the recordings. There's other problems that have to do with tape speed and with the fact that these are stylus and groove arrangements, and there was some skipping and repeating going along. The National Research Council used one recording and used that, claimed that was the synchronization, made very little effort to figure out why you have these discrepancies in the timing, and reached the conclusion that the two events were not synchronous. However, if we use a different time, let's go back and use the simulcast, which is actually the closest one to the time of the shots, which is when Fisher, Deputy Chief Fisher, says, "I'll check it." That happens just 2 seconds before Chief Curry said he was at the triple underpass. And now I will actually play for you the Channel 1 recording. As I said, the sounds that sound like gunshots are going to sound like just a static, snap, crackle, pop. But we can, I use that broadcast by Chief Fisher where he says, "I'll check it," to actually find them on the recording. Here we go. I'll play that again so you can hear that sequence again. So if you use that simulcast closest to the time of the shooting, so you have less effect of these other problems causing the time discrepancies, you get an exact synchronization between the time when these sounds were deposited on the recording and when President Kennedy was actually assassinated. Now, the obvious thing to do is to take the audio and match it up to the video. Remember, you've got this obvious event at frame 313 where the President Kennedy's head is ruptured by the impact of the gunshot. Earlier, one of the problems is that we saw trying to detect when anybody else was actually impacted by a gunshot. Governor Connally obviously is in anguish between frames 230 and 240 of the Zapruder film. The Warren Commission hypothesized that this could have been a delayed reaction. The actual impact could have been at an earlier point. Some photogrammetric studies indicated, for example, at frame 227, 228, Connolly's hat flips up. And we know that the bullet struck Governor Connally in the wrist. It turns out at frame 224, 225, we see the flap of Governor Connolly's jacket, and the bullet went through the front of his jacket. So we think that that is the point that shows since it's followed in the sequence by the hat flipping up and then Governor Conley obviously in anguish, that the point of impact was at 224, 225. And the time lapse, the time interval between frame 224 and 313 is exactly 4.8 seconds. And so we have exact correlation to our third shot here and our fourth shot here, which is the grassy knoll shot, the head shot. One more aspect of this that, for the details, you can look at this article. It came up during the House Select Committee's questioning of the acoustical experts. They asked Professor Weiss if he could identify the sound, from the sound of the shot, from the signature, what kind of rifle it was. And he answered yes that he could, but he'd rather not go there. And they asked him why, and he said because it got into some issues that were non-acoustic, that he needed to know the path of the bullet. And if he knew the path of the bullet, he could calculate what kind of rifle it was, at least its muzzle velocity. And he'd rather not get into that. And of course the problem was, again, the legacy of the Warren Commission was that the House Select Committee decided that because the medical evidence, the Warren Commission had said that he was not shot in the head, there was no medical evidence for shot in the head from the front, that the shot from the front must have missed. Of course, what we've heard some yesterday and from the filmed evidence showing the head going backwards, and I just showed you that the correlation between the acoustical and video evidence, we would say that he was shot in the head, and therefore we do know the path of the bullet going from here to here, and from that we can calculate the muzzle velocity of the bullet. And what you use is the shock wave of the bullet itself, because that's also picked up in the Dallas police tape. 24 milliseconds before the putative muzzle blast, you have an impulse that looks like a shock wave, and from that you can extrapolate to calculate that velocity, and you calculate to a muzzle velocity of 2,450 feet per second, plus or minus about 90 feet per second. It turns out that if you look into a table, ballistics table, 3030 Winchester has that velocity. And that brings us back to the acoustical evidence. Because of this broadcast, it's also on the recording. The Warren Commission didn't go into that broadcast. So in conclusion, summarize what we have. There are 5 sounds on the police recording that have the acoustical characteristics of gunfire. All 5 suspect sound patterns match to the echo patterns of test shots fired in the plaza. The sequence and spacing, the order in the data is what convinced the acoustical expert to conclude that the gunshots are on the recording. The sonar analysis by the second group places it on the grassy knoll. The degree of match is statistically significant. Films do show a motorcycle at or near at least the positions predicted by the acoustical evidence. That subject motorcycle had a microphone relay problem. The suspect sounds were deposited on the recording simultaneous with the assassination if we use the simulcast closest to the time of the assassination. The sequence of shots on the audio matches the video sequence of wounding, and the shockwave precedence matches to the muzzle velocity at 30-30. And I thank you all very much for your attention.
We can take about 10-15 minutes of questions.
Yeah, wasn't there a 6th shot also? I think I remember Ashkenazi, one of the professors at Queens College, thought that the probability was not as high as the others.
There is a 6th pattern. There's another pattern in there. Oh, sorry. The question was whether or not there was evidence for a 6th shot. There is another sound pattern which is about a second ahead of the very first pattern. I remember one of the characteristics that we were looking for is that it should have around gunshot should produce around 10 impulses. This particular impulse pattern only had 4. So it would fail the first criteria, one of the criteria. But then they put their brains to it and they thought, well, what if it was just a pistol? And therefore not as loud as a rifle shot, they would capture fewer echoes. And that's the reason that they fired, they had a pistol firing from the grassy knoll. Another reason might be they thought, the witnesses said that the rifle was sticking out of the window, but they thought, okay, well, what if the rifle for the first shot was withdrawn inside the windowsill? Might that have muffled the sound and produced fewer large echoes? So they did that also. They fired test shots with the rifle fired inside the building, and they did not get a match when they did the comparison to the test shots. Well, yeah, you could throw. Yeah, we're trying to deal strictly with the evidence that we have and test the hypothesis based on our observed data.
To clarify that, a silencer would affect the acoustical pattern?
You wouldn't. Yeah, clearly you would. If you don't, you're not going to have an echo pattern if you don't have a big blast.
Don, David Wimp has pointed out that the 313 is blurred. I think one of your really dynamite arguments is the swiftness with which that blur occurs. In other words, at 312, nothing has happened. At 313, you have impact on Kennedy's head, but you also have a blurred frame, which means that the Zapruder has moved his camera. And I believe your argument takes the form of showing that if one assumes a shot came from the depository, the shock wave would not be there in time to produce that blurring. Hence, this is a separate indication of a shot of a firing point much closer to Zapruder than the 6th floor window. Would you summarize your argument?
Well, I think you did a pretty good job right there. But, well, for comparison, for example, the sound pattern at frame that corresponds to frame 224, there's also a jiggle about frame 227 that follows that, and if you make allowance for the speed of the bullet, the speed of sound, that's exactly, if a shot came from the book depository, that's when you would get the jiggle. So that corresponds. Conversely, the jiggle occurs much too fast to have come from the book depository. But if you simulate a shot from the grassy knoll, then the timing is just right.
Was the Dow tax building taken into consideration?
When they fired these test shots, they were, you remember, to do triangulation, you have to have 2 points in your triangle known. What they were looking for, the third point in the triangle, was really the motorcycle, the microphone. So they fired their test shots from the book depository because that's a known place, and then from the grassy knoll because known in respect that there was a lot of evidence for a shot from there. And that enabled them to triangulate onto to find the motorcycle. Once they found the motorcycle, then the second laboratory could go ahead and look for that shot from the grassy knoll. But as far as firing a test shot from these other places, no, they had not done that. They weren't looking for. Now, there's a 5th shot, so there seems to be a rogue shot in there, and the question is, where does that come from?
2 observations, plus I wanted your comments. The first one, you mentioned that Officer McLean was subsequently re-interviewed and said he did have a motorcycle with a stuck-open mic. That's true, but the day after he testified, it was in the LA Times, when Blakey said there was a 4th shot, 95%. The Officer McLean says, I do have a motorcycle with a stuck open mic on occasion, but I didn't ride it that day. The guy on the Stemmons Freeway rode it that day. The other one is, who was that guy that testified? Was it Wise or Aronofsky? Okay, he said in effect that any of the 4 shots could also have been a false alarm. And it was, in other words, all these shots with all the acoustical stuff, the distance, the speed, and everything, any single one of them could have just as well been not only a shot, but it could have been a peck mark on a record. And he said it under questioning from Christopher Dodd. What's the chances of the 4th shot? In fact, what's the chance of any of the 4 shots being a false alarm or maybe a peck mark on a recording? And the answer was 1 in 5. So that's where Dodd came up with 80% times 95%, which equals 76%. So your comments on that, please.
Yeah, I'll start out with McLean. What I'll say about McLean's testimony, and he said other things too, which the idea that there was a conspiracy in the Kennedy assassination is kind of anathema to the Dallas police law enforcement. And when he testified, he didn't know what they were getting at. After he found out that they were using him to support the idea of conspiracy, he started backtracking about a lot of things. As far as the false alarm that Ashkenazi brought up, yes, anything you can imagine that is random could produce a sound pattern, and there's a finite possibility that that's what these are. It's false alarm. It could be just static. There could have been something wrong with the circuitry of the motorcycle so that you would generate a pattern, and any pattern that's random can mimic any other pattern, so there's a finite possibility. What he was getting at with that, when he was talking about 1 chance in 5, that he was talking about there is, remember, you got 36 shots, so you got 36 opportunities. So even if it's a long shot that any one would match, heck, you got 36 chances. Multiply that times 2 for the 2 different locations, and you have to factor that all in. That's why I went into a more formal statistical analysis to show that. Even if it were true that there was a high probability that you could get a match, it would be in random order. And that's that pattern I showed you, how they were in order in the street. So the topological order matched the chronological order. That wouldn't have happened, and that's also factored into the analysis.
Let me say one more thing. There's one other thing that is hard to get around. The Academy of Sciences said the chances that a shot can sound the same as a peck mark is impossible. In other words, there's 66 peck marks on that tape. Any one of them you could study if you were told it was a shot, and you could come up with the distance, the speed, and everything else of the shot. And in the 20 seconds where the shots are most likely, there's 16 of those peck marks. And the National Academy said the idea that the peck marks and the shots sound exactly alike is impossible. How do you get around that one? Your comments, please.
I'm not sure what you mean by a peck mark. I think you're talking about...
Peck marks are when somebody was transcribing the recording.
Oh, put scratches on.
Yeah, and they keep turning the needle back, and it makes a peck mark. That's what all those 66 sounds of static are on the 90 seconds recording, and there's 16 specks of static on the 20 seconds where the shots are most likely.
Okay, I think you're talking about the static marking rate was about 8 per second. Maybe that's what you were getting at. And of course, they were eroding the tape, and you're getting scratches on there. But we're talking about impulses that are apart by milliseconds. So you're not going to create 10 peck marks within a space of 100 milliseconds.
Well, any of those 66 peck marks, if the scientists were told they were a gunshot, they could come up with the type of weapon used, the location of the weapon, and the speed of the bullet. If they assumed that any of those 66 peck marks were gunshots.
Well, you've lost me, because I don't know what you're talking about, because what you're saying there has nothing to do with what the acoustical experts were looking at here.
You know that Robert Blakey said this in an interview. He says, we could not determine any of the shots from those sounds. We used a 10-point system that had nothing to do with acoustics. It had to do with the location on the tape and the location between each peck marks. And we used a series of 10, which is not scientific at all, but is based on where the shots would be most likely to be. We took those peck marks based on a series of 10, and we put those for acoustical analysis. So they're doing an analysis on assumptions based on a series of 10, which is not scientific.
What you're talking about has absolutely nothing to do with what the acoustical experts did. And I've spoken to Blakey a number of times, and I've never heard him say talk about tech marks or peck marks or whatever you're talking about.
You heard the recordings.
Discussion afterwards, or other people get other questions. I mean, it's fair. I mean, you had about 6, 7 questions.
Yeah, if anybody wants to debate with me, they can, I'll be here.
You referred to the jiggling of the camera at, I think, 224 as well as at the time of the fatal shot. 228, sorry.
227.
I thought that actually it was even better than that, that the analysis of the film, picking out the places where Zapruder jiggled the camera, matched up, the places where he jiggled the camera matched up with almost all of these impulses. Am I mistaken about that?
No, they do, right.
They did.
But you lose some resolution the further you get back, because the only places I know where you can actually pinpoint where somebody actually gets shot on the film,
Yes.
so that you know you have a shot, is where you see Conley get hit, and where he flaps his lapel, and where...
But I think you're underestimating the significance of that, because we're talking about a totally independent source of evidence showing the same sequence of time points.
That's
the
right.
chances of that happening randomly are...
A visual confirming the audio.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Now, my second question, if I may, there's recently been a story that there's some digitation and cleaning up the tape going on. Do you expect that to improve our knowledge about this at all?
I wouldn't expect it to add much to the acoustical evidence per se. What it might well do is give us a better context in terms of timelines, and because the problem is the different playbacks, again, because of these recordings were stylus and groove arrangements, whenever they play them back, you always get a skips and repeats. So all the known playbacks are different from one another. This gives us a chance to play back the whole thing without any of those skips and repeats. And so, I say, maybe you'll have a better record of the broadcast and a better timeline. As for these, the impulses themselves, what you can't get around is as the fellow mentioned, this recording was not made for multiple playbacks. And so the more you play it, the more you erode the impulses that are there. So I assume when they put that laser down the groove, it's going to pick up the original divots as well as anything that's been added on there in the meantime.
Bob? Don? 2 things very quickly. Number 1, which was the shot of the 5? Which was the one that was eliminated of those 5?
The third.
The third one. Thank you. And second of all, do you have Zapruder frame correlations for those shots, for the 5 or 6 shots?
From memory, I believe it was 175, 202, 224, 313, and then add 0.7 of a second to come up with 325 or something in there.
Thank you.
Just to get a better perspective, were the 2 minutes before the time in question and 2 or 3 minutes after the time in question relatively acoustically flat as far as the baseline goes? In other words, was that 8 or 10 seconds more active acoustically than the previous or subsequent time?
In terms of the large impulses, which they screened the first time, yeah, no, they found one about 17 seconds after this cluster. There was it was about 30 seconds after, but it lasted for, I think, it was by itself and it was too long. And then towards the very end, about 5 minutes into the recording, there's another little sequence of large impulses also. So there is other places in the 5.5 minutes where you can find large impulse trains. But nowhere did they meet all 4 of those criteria except at that one place, 136 seconds into the recording.
Thank you, Don. We'll now take a 10-minute break.
Here's what's ahead on C-SPAN. Next, more on the Warren Report and its legacy.
C-SPAN.
After a short break, the discussion about the Warren Report's findings on the lone assassin theory continued. This panel focused on the physical evidence. It's about an hour and a half.
First, I would like to announce for those of you who do not already know that we're being taped by C-SPAN today. It is not airing live, and we don't know yet when it will run, but we're very happy to have C-SPAN here. We've heard so far in this conference some rather amazing evidence, which I feel strongly indicates, overwhelmingly indicates, the existence of shots from more than one location, which means a conspiracy. But there is a dissenter here who wanted an opportunity to express a dissenting point of view, and that is Dr. Ken Ron from the University of Rhode Island. He will now give his talk on the harmony of the physical evidence.
Thank you very much, Jim. I'd like to begin by offering my appreciation to Jim Lazar and the organizing committee for giving me a chance to discuss with you for a half an hour or so the neutron activation analysis and the power of this in looking into the assassination through a different lens than... No. Is this one? This one? This one? Oh, here it is. It's over here. Okay, thank you. I want to look at the assassination with you in a little different way. During the last couple of days, one of the speakers alluded to it yesterday, I believe, that there's been a lot of confusion, there's been a lot of conflicting evidence. And I think that's a natural result of the type of evidence that's being discussed and the type of evidence that's discussed primarily at these JFK conferences. But there's another way to look at the assassination, and that's through the lens of the hard physical evidence, the validated physical evidence. As I was sitting in the back the other day, I was thinking, thank goodness for the physical evidence, and thank goodness for the neutron activation that organizes the physical evidence. And this is what I'd like to show you in the next half an hour or so. My talk is entitled The Harmony of the Physical Evidence. The major physical evidence, major types of physical evidence are listed here. I can't discuss them all today. Rifle, bullets and fragments, neutron activation, cartridge cases, fingerprints, brown paper bag wounds, clothing, etc., etc. You all know these types of evidence. The physical evidence makes, when combined, a physical framework, a strong web that might better be called an impregnable wall. The neutron activation knits it all together. According to the words of my co-author, Larry Sturdivant, famed ballistician from HSCA days, the neutron activation is truly the queen of the physical evidence. It is the strongest physical evidence, the strongest new physical evidence to emerge from the HSCA hearings. Let me just quickly review with you the bullets and fragments. This is, by neutron activation, we mean chemical analysis of the 5 major bullets and fragments that were recovered from the crime scene and from the hospital. They're listed here. I think you all know them. The ones in light blue are the ones that do not contain lead, and so we're not talking about. But the 5 lead fragments, very briefly, are Q1, the bullet from the stretcher in the hospital, a core plus a jacket. Q2, a fragment from the front seat cushion, core plus jacket. Q4 and 5, Q lead fragments from JFK's head. Q9, 3 fragments from Connolly's arm, and Q14, 3 fragments from the rear carpet underneath Mrs. Connolly's seat. This is a little diagram of where they came from, and I think everybody in the room is familiar with this. So we will go on. These fragments were analyzed chemically 3 times, actually. The first time overnight on the night of the assassination by the FBI by optical emission spectroscopy. That failed because the technique was too coarse. They then turned to neutron activation, which was a technique coming into its own in those days. It was done first. It was done twice by neutron activation, first by the FBI in May 1964 for the Warren Commission, not publicized. It contained multiple systematic errors that Vincent Gwynne later discovered and resolved. The data were kept secret by the FBI, presumably because there was confusion as to what they actually meant. They did not, as seen then, show a clear story. Then for the HSCA in 1977, Dr. Vincent P. Gwynne of UC Irvine reanalyzed the fragments. This work, in contrast to the first set of analyses, was highly publicized, showed 2 clear groups of fragments, and ultimately agreed with the FBI's analysis. The goal of this work was very simple and limited. It was to try to determine how many bullets hit the men by seeing whether the little fragments, the tiny fragments, too small to have ballistic engravings, could be associated chemically with the larger ballistically engraved fragments. The result of this, as I will show in great detail, are 2 clear groups of fragments, each containing 1 big fragment and 1 or 2 little ones. This is positive evidence for 2 and only 2 bullets, both fired from Oswald's rifle. This is one of the strongest results from any of the physical evidence. Here's the summary of the FBI's original analyses and Gwynne's follow-up analysis. The FBI's data consisted of 4 replicate runs, and you can see the arrows pointing to them. Gwynne's analysis, a decade later, is the black squares in the middle. Now you see essentially 5 parallel lines here. 5 groups. The idea is you have to look horizontally laterally across each analysis, and you will see Q1 and Q9 on the left, which form a group at about, well, according to Gwynne's measurements, about 800 parts per million of antimony. This is the prime indicator element. And then you will see a group on the right containing 3 fragments, Q2, Q4, 5, and Q14. The group on the left is from the body shot. The group on the right is from the head shot. The point is, 2 analyses separated by more than a decade agreed with one another. They each gave 2 groups. The next question, a very important one, is, are these groups distinct from one another? There are 4 ways to check this distinctness, and if we had time, and maybe in the questions we can go into this a little bit more. By the way, I'm going to solicit lots of questions from the audience today because we have an unusual opportunity here of interested people gathered together, and I want to make sure everybody leaves this room with a good basic understanding of what's going on here about the neutron activation and its power. So when I finish, I will take whatever questions you have on this, and I hope that you will leave with a good idea of what's going on. There are 4 ways to check the distinctness of the groups, the separateness of the groups. Number 1, just look at the samples. Number 2, look at the means and the standard deviations. These are increasingly complex. Number 3, test the difference of means statistically. And number 4, Larry Sturtevant, general linear model analysis. If we just look at this, just look at the samples. Here they are from Gwynne's results, which is probably the best set of analysis on this. The group on the left represents the body bullet, the stretcher and the wrist fragments. The group on the right represents the head bullet. You see the values are in the little circles, and you see 95% confidence limits. That's 2 standard deviations, the arrows up and down from there. The groups are separate. You can just see it. If you want to go a little farther, you can look at the means and the standard deviations of the fragments within each of the groups. When you do this, if you take the log scale here for doing this, and we'll show why we do that in a moment, here you see the top group and the lower group, and you see the means differ and the standard deviations on each one, the means differ by 8 standard deviations. That huge. The groups are separate. If you want to go a little farther, you can test the significance of the means. In order to do that, you have to find the underlying distribution of the concentrations of antimony in Mannlicher-Carcano bullets in general. The way you do that is to use a set of 14 test bullets that Vincent Guin got from each of the 4 lots of Mannlicher-Carcano bullets that were manufactured by Western Cartridge Company. You first examine these for a normal distribution. This is standard statistical practice. When you do that, you put on a normal plot. If they are normally distributed, the points, each point represents a bullet here, will lie on a straight line. They don't. They fall off at the low end. The distribution is not normal. That shouldn't surprise anybody. Most things in nature are log normally distributed. We see this in almost anything in the real world is distributed logarithmically, not linearly. If we try a log normal distribution, which is the standard statistical practice, next step from there, voila, we get a straight line. So to a good first approximation, these Mannlicher-Carcano bullets, the antimony, at least the prime indicator element here, is distributed log normally. I will come back to this point in the second half of the talk. It's a very important point. We know the underlying distribution. There is a single underlying distribution. We now can do statistical tests on it. Oh, and by the way, the red points, here's the same 14 test bullets and the 2 red dots in the upper right represent the 2 groups of fragments from the assassination, and you see they fall within the range of the others. There's nothing special about these 2 groups of fragments from the assassination. We go to test the means, and if you look at the bottom here, you will see that there is less than 3 parts in 1,000 chance that the means are the same. They're different. The same time now. If we do it with a normal distribution instead of log normal distribution, get the same thing. Less than 3 chances in 1,000 that the means are the same, so they are different. Larry Sturtevant, master's degree in statistics, co-author with me, has gone through a deeper analysis here, the general linear model analysis. The point of it all is, look down the bottom here, he gets a probability of 1 in 10 to the third, that's 1,000, or 1 in 10,000 that the groups arose by chance. So it's not. Okay. Now that we have 2 significant groups, what is the significance of this distinctness? And I'm going to give you a long list of significances here. Okay. Number 1, all fragments came from Oswald's rifle. That's because the little fragments match chemically with the big ones, and the big ones have ballistic engravings on them. Right? 2, Oswald's rifle was fired that day. This is the only way I know of to determine scientifically that the rifle was fired that day. And the way you do that is, again, to look at these two groups. Each group has a big fragment, the stretcher fragment, for example, in the group on the left, and the wrist fragment. The stretcher fragment might have been dropped on the stretcher by somebody. We'll grant that. But the wrist fragment got put into the custody of the FBI immediately in the hospital. And the same thing happens in the other group on the right with from the headshot. The large fragment found in the front seat, somebody could have dropped that in the front seat maybe, but not so for the fragments from the brain. So they all match. So that validates everybody by doing it this way. 3, no fragments or cartridge cases were planted. Same basic argument here. Number 4, must have been a forward snap. How do we know that? Because both bullets come from Oswald's rifle to the rear. And when a bullet hits from the rear, it has to snap the head forward. The question is how much? Okay? For anyone who doubts the reality of the head snap, please watch this. This is an animation prepared by a colleague of mine. We'll go through this a couple times. Alexander Dort in Brussels. Watch Kennedy's head. This is 310 to 316 or something. Watch Kennedy's head with respect to the other heads. This is a tenth of a frame. Everybody else is rock solid. Kennedy's head goes forward. Five. This predicts the proper speed of the forward snap. If you know the incoming properties of the Mannlicher-Carcano bullet, mass, velocity, you know its momentum, you know how much is going to be imparted to the head, you know how much a head weighs, you can calculate how fast the head must snap forward, and that's exactly what you see in the Zapruder film, about 3 feet per second or so. 6, the big rearward lurch does not come from the frontal hit. Have come from a frontal hit. The reason is the bullets, all the evidence is that the 2 bullets that hit come from the rear. The lurch has properties, which I don't have time to go into today. The lurch, the timing of the lurch has properties of something other than a bullet. Number 7, renders the locations of the entrance and exit wounds to JFK's head moot. The reasoning here is very simple. You know the shot started from the rear because of the engravings. You know it passed through the head because of the chemical match between the head fragments and the larger fragment, and the fragment wound up in the front seat. Starts in the depository, Oswald's rifle, passes through the head, winds up in the front seat. We, for most purposes, don't need to know more than that. Same thing happens for the back wound, but the reasoning is a little bit more involved. We have CE-399, which started out in Oswald's rifle, and we know it started out that day. It left its telltale signature in Connolly's wrist as it passed through, and it wound up in Connolly's thigh, which is in the front of the car. Renders the offset of the holes in JFK's clothing moot. Same reasoning as above. 1 bullet passed through the body. Right? The offset of a few inches doesn't matter. Right? 10, invalidates all conspiracy theories with other shooters or planted bullets, and I'm going to show you that in just a couple minutes. 11, leads ultimately to the best shooting scenario, in our opinion at least. First shot is an early miss, 150 to 160 or so, missed and hit the street or the grass. Rushed shot, his car passed under the tree. Second shot, around 222 to 224. Passed through both men and recovered as TE-399. Third shot, 312 to 313. Exited as 3 large fragments, 2 of which were recovered from the front seat, the third of which passed over the top of the windshield and down to Teg. Larry Sturtevant has a proprietary ballistics program that he sells for thousands of dollars that can simulate as well as possible the movements and the curvature of movements, a potential curvature, I should say, of large fragments of lead. And everything works out. It is entirely possible to get a bullet just over the top, a fragment, I should say, just over the top of the windshield. If you look, it's even in Josiah Thompson's book, the depository, the location of the limousine at 313, and Teg line up within a few degrees. And the ballistics and the mechanics work out for that too. And lastly, brings Oswald much closer to the crime. His rifle did it all. His prints were found on the rifle in the boxes. His clipboard, his paper bag, his backyard photo, his flight from the depository, his killing of Tippit in cold blood, and his attempt to kill again in the Texas theater. In summary, the physical evidence from the neutron activation and the fragments in the ballistics show that 2 bullets from Oswald's rifle did everything that day. Now, let me talk about chance matches, because this is going to come up later. Okay? If you know the underlying distribution of antimony in the Mannlicher-Carcano bullets, you can estimate the chance, for example, that the wrist fragment, the thing that is alleged to be the wrist fragment, could have been an accidental or chance match with CE-399. You can estimate that in a very straightforward way. The answer turns out to be level 1 here, 2% to 3%. For one fragment, assume the best that a conspirator could do, picking out Mannlicher-Carcano bullets, only a probability of a chance match of the highest you can get is 2% to 3%. And that's with the same kind of bullet. If you use another kind of bullet, but still with antimony in it, that drops down by a factor of 10 to 100 or down to 1 part in 1,000 to 1 part in 10,000. If you use a bullet with pure lead cores, it becomes essentially zero. If you consider 2 random matches between little fragments and big fragments, you just square the answers you get in the previous one. The 2% to 3% becomes 0.4% to 0.9%, and on it goes down like that. If you consider 5 random matches, which not too many people propose, but for the sake of argument, then it drops down to basically 1 part in a million and that's the highest you could get, 1 part in a million that these arise by chance. Larry Sturtevant has been able to do something here that I don't think anybody else has done, and that is mathematically to eliminate the most popular conspiracy theories, the ones that involve other shooters on other fragments. It's a huge achievement. I'd like to spend the second half of this talk on some recent objections that have been raised by Stu Wexler. Those of you who have been following the goings-on of this business for the last 3 years know that every time I go somewhere to talk about the neutron activation, Stu pops up. Every time I write a message to a news group, Stu writes a message in return. To try to describe this feeling to you, I want to give you a quote by George Miller from Harvard University many years ago, in March 1956, in Psychological Review, where he's talking about, this is an introduction to his article, where he's talking about the 7 plus or minus 2 slots in short-term memory available in the human brain, which is a very important thing for linguistics and principles of reading comprehension and so on. Where he says integer, just substitute Stu Wexler, and this is what's been going on. My problem is, I'm just going to read this to you now, just for a second. My problem is that I have been persecuted by an integer. For 7 years, this number has followed me around, has intruded in my most private data, and has assaulted me from the pages of our most public journals. This number assumes a variety of disguises, being sometimes a little larger and sometimes a little smaller than usual, but never changing so much as to be unrecognizable. The persistence with which this number plagues me is far more than a random accident. There is, to quote a famous senator, a design behind it, some pattern governing its appearances. Either there really is something unusual about the number, or else I am suffering from delusions of persecution. Okay? Let me give you a couple of examples. I'm not going to dwell on this, but some of the statements that have been put forth in the past couple of years. November 30th on AAJ stands for the news group Alt Assassination JFK. Larry and Ken, Larry Sturtevant, both need to actually acquaint themselves with the literature on the subject before they respond. They made fundamentally wrong assumptions before they did the work. They flouted convention. They failed to go to actual forensic chemists, blah, 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 blah. Next one. It is difficult to argue with people who assume that they are right and remain willfully ignorant of up-to-date published material on protocols, conventions, and statistics. Third quote. What Ken cannot deny is that his entire case rests upon an edifice of junk science. Without any primary sources, without any background in the statistical arguments being brought against the entire science as a whole, Larry and Kenneth put forth a contrived scenario where Oswald had the unfortunate luck of choosing the only known brands of bullets exempted from the National Academy of Sciences report. Fourth quote and last, Ken knows full well that his own analysis flies completely in the face of the last 10 years of best practice in the area of comparative bullet lead analysis. You would think, with this kind of noise, that there would be something behind it. I'm going to show you that there isn't. Okay? So let's review in a few minutes now Stu's core objections to the JFK analysis, neutron activation analysis, and why they're wrong. First, they are based on a 2004 report entitled Weighing Bullet Lead Evidence by the Committee on Scientific Assessment of Bullet Lead Elemental Composition Comparison, National Research Council of the National Academies. This report deals with composition analysis of bullet lead used to examine potential links between bullets or fragments from crime scenes and boxes of bullets found elsewhere in the possession of a suspect. Okay? The findings of this Academy panel can be stated very briefly. The links are often overstated, procedures and interpretations need to be tightened, but the technique itself, CABL, is still useful. Stu's objections center on 4 things, and I'm going to take up each one of these things very briefly. The viability of this basic technique, the scenarios for using it, the JFK bullet leads, and the resulting statistics. Viability. Stu says CABL, comparative analysis of bullet lead, is a failed technique. The report that he uses says something rather different. In many cases, CABL is a reasonably accurate way of determining whether 2 bullets could have come from the same compositionally indistinguishable volume of lead. Very different. Stu, Vincent Gwynne's legacy is essentially going down the toilet. A member of this committee told me in February 2004, bluntly, this report should not affect Vince's legacy. Stu, at its more recent incarnation, the requirement is at least 7 elements, but the report says, although little power to detect matches would be lost if silver or bismuth were dropped from the analytical procedure using ICP-OES, no time or effort would be saved by measuring 5 rather than 7 elements. They really don't care. The last 2 elements don't matter. And you can see this in detail in a little table from the report. This is table 2.4 from the actual report. This is the percentage of variation or the discriminating power of groups of elements. With 3 elements, you get 83% of the total, 4 elements, 96%, and after that, the last 3 elements you add, copper, bismuth, and silver, you only go up by 2%. I say 3 elements, or maybe 4 elements, are really all you need, and the committee's remarks are very similar to that. Point 2, scenarios. Stu says, there's absolutely no difference between conventional CABL and its application to the JF case, but in fact, there is a very important difference. CABL, as talked about in the report, considers a broad question, matching bullets or fragments from the crime scene to boxes of bullets found somewhere else. The JFK NAA is much more constricted. It is narrow. It focuses on bullets and fragments from the same crime scene. The JFK situation is much tighter and much stronger conclusions can rightly be drawn from it. The JFK equivalent to CABL, which of course we're not doing, is collect 1 or 2 fragments from the crime scene, find Oswald's box of bullets somewhere, analyze them both, and compare the compositions. That's not what's going on here. Bullet leads. Stu says MC bullets are not unique. The reality is, Mannlicher-Carcano bullets, I should say, the reality is that these bullets are fundamentally different from the bullets considered by the National Research Council report. Okay? A couple of quotes and then some actual facts and data here. From the report, CABL assumes that a source of bullet lead is homogeneous. A source is a vat. It weighs tons. They give tables to back up this claim. I'm going to not go into the details of these things, but let's work from the small scale up to the big scale and examine the scenario that the report is dealing with. First, within bullet variations. That means take a bullet, take the core, subdivide it, analyze them separately, and see if you find variations down the length of the core. They posit and show evidence that these variations within bullet leads, within cores, a couple percent. That's a pittance compared to what I'm about to show you. Here's another table from the same report. You look across the blue one within bullet from an 800 bullet subset. 5%, 2%, 2%, 4%, 5%. Very, very small. Variations within larger masses are also very small. Wires, slugs, and bullets. The extrusion process used to produce the wire from a bullet is thought to negate any inhomogeneity due to segregation. Coons and Grant have sampled wires produced from bullets and found that concentrations remain constant over several bullets. A bullet is a big slug that weighs hundreds of pounds. It is reasonable to assume that cutting the wire to produce the bullets and pressing the slugs to form the final bullets produce no substantial segregation of elements. On and on it goes. Okay? And we have some data for these larger masses. Within lots, Randich et al., 6%, 2%, 3%, 1%, 2%. Larger masses can become somewhat distinguishable, but they're still small compared to the Mannlicher-Carcano. Now I want to show you what the Mannlicher-Carcano data are and how different this stuff is. Okay? Here's a table I made up a few years ago. Look at the left-hand column. This is the 14 individual bullets, antimony in these bullets sampled by Gwynne. Antimony goes from 200 to 1,200 parts per million. That's a factor of 60, 6,000%, if you like. Okay? Quarters of bullets. Look, they're almost as large variation. Only, large factors there too. Here is a comparison between Mannlicher-Carcano bullets on the left and the type of bullets shown in the NRC report. No comparison. Qualitatively different. CABL is homogeneous up to a melt, a few tons. Mannlicher-Carcano lead is heterogeneous within a bullet, but melts are indistinguishable, just the opposite. CABL lead becomes heterogeneous at 1 ton or more, whereas Mannlicher-Carcano lead is heterogeneous at 1/10 of an ounce. You couldn't find things more different than that. Okay? Stu ignores this huge difference. We have absolutely no reason to think that these bullets are fundamentally different from any other bullet. Well, you just saw the data that refutes that. Okay? You have no primary source material whatsoever to support the notion of exceptionalism. Mocks the idea. Go on, let me skip over this. Randomness of bullets. Okay? Bullet boxes are essentially non-random samples, mixed haphazardly, packaged conveniently, etc., etc. Let me show you the reality of randomness within Mannlicher-Carcano bullets. Here are the 4 lots, each shown by a different color. The 14 bullets from the 4 lots. I would like you to note that the bullets from the red lot span the range, the bullets from the green lot span almost the range, the bullets from the blue lot span the range. The lots are indistinguishable. This is normal, okay? Let me just, summary of Stu's claims. They're all wrong. That's the summary, okay? What's going on here? What's the reason for this campaign? In a word, I will be brief, I know time is coming. In a word, Stu has a scenario that requires 2 Mannlicher-Carcano rifles being fired from the rear. I won't give you... He requires a second Mannlicher-Carcano shooter from the rear, but he doesn't have any physical evidence for that shooter. Failing that, he needs a second rifle from the rear, but he doesn't have any physical evidence for that. Failing that, he needs a third Mannlicher-Carcano bullet. The only way, but he doesn't have the third bullet because the neutron activation does not allow that third bullet. There's only 2 groups. So he's got to drop in, he's got to show that one of the bullets that looks like it's in a group is not really in the group. So he invokes an accidental match from an undiscovered third bullet from an undiscovered second Mannlicher-Carcano rifle fired by an undiscovered second shooter. All the claims are wrong. Okay? Final point. Our alleged inability to pass peer review. Is it any wonder these guys can't pass peer review? I've got a pretty darn good idea that he is being rejected and why. This is why Ken couldn't get published in a peer-reviewed journal if he started one himself. So I asked Stu. I said, Stu, if we get published in a peer-reviewed journal, are you prepared to publicly retract these claims? And we got the long answer, but basically it means yes. Okay? So I announced today that we have 2 peer-reviewed journals, 2 peer-reviewed articles. They are just out in the October issue of Journal of Radioanalytical and Nuclear Chemistry. That's a European journal. First one, Ron and Sturtevant, Part 1, data interpretation. Second one, Part 2, extended benefits. They contain the 2 analyses, the 2 groups, the uniqueness of antimony, the distinctness of WCC MC lead, Gwynn's conclusions, the problem of heterogeneity and its resolution, chance matches, all the stuff I talked about today is in those articles. It's all peer-reviewed. It's out for the world to see. Stu's going to talk. This is the last thing. Stu's going to talk for a half an hour. I don't know what he's going to say, but if he says that CABL is dead, please remind him that's not what the NRC committee said. They still support it. If he says Gwynn's reputation has gone down the toilet, please remind him that's not what the committee member said. If he says you can't get a valid distribution from 14 bullets, show him we just did it. The four lots overlap. If he says MC bullets are no different from the others, remind him, show him that table of actual data that I showed. If he shows you can't eliminate an accidental match, I say, agree with him, but the chance is 2% at best. Okay? And then ask him whether he wants to base his whole theory on an idea that it's at least 88% certain of being wrong. If he says we can never get published, show him the 2 articles. If he says Oswald is unlucky enough to use super special ammunition, congratulate him for getting one right. Thank you.
All right, we're now going to have a period of questioning led by Professor Rohn, and then we'll have Stu Wexler respond.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. My light's bright. I thought I would start out, if I may, by asking Professor Rahm 2 brief questions of my own that'll take about a couple minutes for him to answer, and then turn it open to the floor to ask as many questions as rapidly as you can of Professor Rahm. And the first question I would ask him, after your long and scholarly study of the assassination and expertise in the various aspects of it, how many bullets were fired during the assassination?
Is this working? Yeah?
Yes.
Good. We have, the short answer is I don't know for sure. We have positive physical evidence for 2, both from Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle. And by the way, I can't put Oswald's finger on the trigger, by the way. There's no physical evidence for that. But nothing has come forward. Nothing has been shown in the last 4 years that it was somebody else. 2 from Oswald's rifle that did all the damage that we know about. As the Warren Commission said, the weight of the evidence from the 3 expended cartridge cases and so on, and the weight of the ear witness evidence is that there was a 3rd shot. We happen to think that was an early missed shot from some other minor pieces of evidence. Whether there was anything more, I don't know. There's no evidence for it. So I say guaranteed 2 and a possibility of another one.
Thank you. Then my second question, also brief, has 2 parts. And the first part is relates to the chain of possession of the elements that you have under consideration. I spent a good deal of time on this general subject, and then the second question is, do you have all of the bulletry in your base? Are there any portions or pieces that are not in the base? For example, the Oliver bullet, or the Aldridge shot, or the Lester bullet, or the Larrabee, and so forth? Or are you confident that you have all of those? So those are 2 questions: chain of possession and totality of the specimens.
Let me answer the second one first. Totality of specimens. Obviously, we don't have everything that might have been fired. The first missed shot, we have no record of, if there was a first missed shot. The line of fragments through the head, most of them were too small to be taken out by the autopsy physicians. They took out 2. Our default starting point has to be that those 2 are representative. If there was a missed shot, obviously, we don't have a missed shot from the knoll, for example. If there was such a thing, I happen to believe that there's no solid evidence supporting it, but if there was such a thing, no, we don't have it. But missing evidence is inherently neutral. It doesn't tell you yes or no one way or the other. Our conclusions are to be based on the evidence that we do have, those 5 basic bullets and fragments that we do have and have been analyzed.
All right, and then the second part, on the chain of possession, the integrity of the chain of possession.
I know there have been a lot of questions raised about that. I would give a 2-part answer to that. The first part is, maybe neither part is going to satisfy many people in this room, but it's what I believe anyhow. The statements, some sworn by the people who handled CE-399, for example, there's mixed opinion. I happen to know and have some precedent that those things would be legally valid if it ever came to trial. So that's my first answer, which I don't think most people here will agree with. Second answer is that I think that is overridden by the neutron activation evidence of the chemical matches.
Okay, thank you. So we'll open it to the floor, and what I thought we'd do, we'd start right down this side, and I'll call on Tink, and then you will take over, and you call the questionnaires as we go.
I get to do all this?
No, I'll do it.
That's all right. No, that's okay.
Tink, do you have a question?
Yeah. Professor Rome, were you here this morning? Were you here this morning?
Yes.
Yes. Did you see the presentations of the three of us this morning?
Yes.
Certainly, as a point of personal privilege, since I found this forward movement or quantified this forward movement some 35 years ago, and I am now absolutely convinced it doesn't exist. And since you saw what David Wynn presented, namely that the forward movement is based on a mistaken interpretation of blurring, that blurring is what caused the alleged forward movement. Yet you continue to announce that you believe that the forward movement is enormously important. Why do you go against the analyses of David Wynn?
Because they're rejected. Very simple. Because you can just look and see it. You can just look and see the forward movement. We know there must be a forward movement because we know the head was hit in the rear. We know roughly what that must be. If you just look at the Zapruder film, the little animation that I showed, Kennedy's head goes forward and the others remain essentially rock steady. So I disagree strongly with that. That's my answer.
You want me to call questions for you? You can sit down.
Okay, this is a better microphone.
Okay. Second question?
I have a question for you.
Okay.
Professor Ron, have you ever had this thesis of yours evaluated by peer review? And has your paper been accepted or rejected by peer review?
Gary, the journal I just mentioned is a peer-reviewed journal. Both articles were submitted and accepted. That's the answer to your question.
Articles are going to appear.
They have appeared. They are out now, just now.
Do we have a copy of them?
No, because I don't have a copy of them yet. They haven't. We've ordered. That gives me a chance to say something else. Larry and I have ordered a large quantity of reprints of each of these, something like 300 of each of them. Anyone will get them. Typically, we'll get them a few weeks after they appear. They appeared somewhere now in the second half of September. Anyone who gives me a business card afterwards, or gives me a piece of paper with their name and mailing address, we will send you a copy of each of those articles.
Now, Larry Sturtevant also had a letter to the editor published in Neurosurgery, and a very complimentary letter to the article that Michael Levy had written in Neurosurgery. It was very apparent to me, somebody who spoke here yesterday, and perhaps to you sitting in the audience, that Michael Levy, a well-intended, honest, sincere neurosurgeon, excellent, no doubt, what he does, knows nothing about the Kennedy case and made huge errors in his paper. Dr. Sturtevant here comments very favorably and makes no comment whatsoever on any of the myriad errors in the paper. One wonders whether Dr. Sturtevant is a detached observer in this subject, and whether this, whether.
So are you suggesting that because he didn't criticize Michael Levy properly, that he is not competent to write about this stuff?
No, what I'm criticizing is that, it's clear that he is not an objective observer in the sense that he is not capable of identifying very obvious errors that are right in front of him that everyone else is aware of,
so once
including
wrong,
errors that were in your paper.
So once wrong, always wrong, in other words.
No, I'm just saying that including errors in your paper, that one of the businesses that you didn't touch upon is the fact that as one of the primary, and you put it as a primary source of evidence, is the bent fiber evidence, which was debunked 25 years ago by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and yet it still exists on your website today if we were to go to it.
Okay, score one for Gary.
Well.
All right. Now we'll go to the next question, going right down this side, and that's, I've forgotten your name. Oh. Right ahead of me, straight. Go with your hand straight up. Yes, please.
Yes. Did you hear Dr. Thomas's presentation this morning? And you reject that also?
Yes.
On what basis? On what basis do you regret
The multiple studies that have shown that the tape was not recorded and that stuck microphone was not in Dealey Plaza. I don't want to get into all this today.
Thank you. Right ahead of you, there's a questionnaire on the aisle, if I may.
Yes. I have no problem with your analysis.
Thank you.
Or the way you presented it.
Thank you.
But I think that a couple of the slides implied something which I think is not true, and I think that it has caused a lot of problems on both sides of the aisle for 40 years. That is that I think what you have made a very strong case for is that there is no firearms evidence that shows a conspiracy, that all the firearms evidence shows that one man fired all the shots. But that is a very different thing from saying that there was no conspiracy.
I agree with you completely.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
My mind is open about the possibility of conspiracy, but it's not open, as Carl Sagan said so far, that my brains fall out.
All right. Next row, right? 2 rows behind him, right on the aisle, please.
I'm handicapped by only having general physics in high school and college, but the one fact that impresses me is that the motorcycle cop on the left rear at the 8 o'clock position windshield was splattered with brain material and blood. You come across from the 8 o'clock position and you're at the 2 o'clock position, which is the grassy knoll. Okay. Simple fact.
Okay. I just ask you to remember that the phenomenon that shot material out of President Kennedy's head was from isotropic forces within the skull, forces in all directions, and that is not directly related to the direction of the hit from the bullet.
No, we have a few more questions here. To the left, right here.
I can't see.
Second, yeah. Yes, you, please.
Yeah,
I've forgotten your name.
Krishpan.
I'm sorry.
Krishpan. Mr. Krishpan.
From Boston.
Clarification. On the fragments that ended up in Governor Connolly's wrist, I know he took to the grave some portion of that. There were some that were taken out of the wrist and matched with the other side. How close were they in terms of the antimony in the areas?
Oh, really close. It was in a tight group. I don't remember the exact, but a couple % off or something. Yeah, really, really close.
Thank you. And right behind you on the aisle.
About the, excuse me. I want to follow up on the gentleman's questions about the bullet fragments. One argument has been that many of the fragments were buried with Connolly that could have been taken from his wrist had Nellie given permission. And had these bullet fragments been removed from his wrist, that might have shown that there was too many fragments for a bullet that was nearly intact. And that's been one of the issues surrounding the assassination for a long time.
I agree about the might have, could have part of that. But these fragments were very tiny and they weighed only a very small amount. And when they're sliced that fine, their mass is a lot less than you might think just by looking at them. So I don't think that's a strong argument. But in any event, we don't have the fragments, and we can't. It's a neutral observation because we don't have the fragments.
Mr. Bradford.
Hello. I guess as a layperson here, I've heard a couple of scientific papers this morning. In the first, we have a variety of scientific corroborating evidence about a shot from the knoll, for instance. There's the acoustics evidence, the jiggle analysis, which matches it. I think there's other stuff not talked about, like the Willis photo, which matches frame 202, and never mind eyewitness testing, and so on and so forth. And I guess, and then there's another, your talk later on about a scientific approach which leads to a different answer. And so as a layperson, of course, you can be a little confused about this. I guess I would like to ask the question that, given that it's well established from a variety of sources that the executive branch of the government was hell-bent on proving that this was not a conspiracy from day one, that I guess what I'm trying to ask is whether your scientific analysis does or does not depend upon the chain of possession of the fragments themselves. and what the chain of possession is for those.
I think we dealt with the chain of possession question already.
You dealt
it's
not-
pretty strong in most cases. For CE 399, you can raise some questions, but the fact that it matches with the other fragments is very strong supporting evidence, in my opinion.
If I may just follow up briefly, I mean, doesn't the match depend upon, for instance, the fragments themselves not have been removed from 399 after it's in the government's possession, for instance?
Well, if you can show me some evidence that they were, then we can talk. But we don't have that now.
We have a question right in the red shirt. I'm sorry, I can't see you.
Professor, you mentioned the Tague shot. Do you believe Tague was hit with the actual fragment, or hit with a piece of concrete, or?
I don't know. In the beginning, I think it was thought that an entire bullet went down there, but I really don't think. And I'm getting most of my understanding about this from Larry Sturdivant, who that was his career, ballistics and wound ballistics and biophysics and so on. But it appears that a large fragment going fast enough could either nick the cheek directly or hit the curb and spray something up. But the fact is, we don't know what exactly the details were, and we probably are not going to know. We do know, however, that not all that the head bullet fragmented into most likely 3 large pieces, of which only 2 were found. The 2 that were found hit near the top of the windshield, dropped back down into the front seat, a little higher trajectory by one of them at the speed at which we presume they were going the direction was right. It could easily have carried it down to Tague and done the damage down there. It's a little bit speculative. I can't prove this.
Thank you. We have one more question, and then Mr. Lazar.
Yeah, Dr. Ron, you made the statement that it didn't matter where the bullet entered the rear of the head. Did you attend the George Lundberg School of Forensic Pathology?
The answer to your question is no and no. I didn't quite make that statement that you said, and I've never met George Lundberg, and I don't think I would not call him a friend of mine to follow that logic. But for most purposes, if our approach to the assassination is to circumscribe it and progressively tighten what we know about it, then the main thing, I think, is that you know that the bullet came in, passed through, and exited. And the details of how this, it's interesting to know. Everybody wants to know this, of course, but I don't think they're material. So my original comment was, if I remember correctly, more for most purposes, you don't really need to know this.
Well, actually, for this case, you do, because there is a 6.5 millimeter fragment of lead in the top rear of the head, which I conclude came from a shot from the front, as did other metal fragments which were present in the corner of the skull removed from the head. Now, can you tell me that those fragments were not deposited by a second bullet?
If you show me some positive chemical elements, chemical information on that. First of all, I will state up front, Randy, I don't agree with you on this.
No, I'm just saying, can you prove by neutron activation analysis that those metal fragments are not related to the other head bullet?
If we don't have the metal fragments, I mean, if you get the metal fragments and analyze them in principle, you can reach some sort of decision about that. But the fragments that are available, those 5 fragments that we have in evidence right now, there is the best you can say, or the worst you can say, is that there's a 98% probability that they came from only 2 bullets.
So your answer is no.
I'm afraid we have to call it to a close. We have one point here on recent research that has to be made at this time, I believe.
Just 2 quick questions. One, my understanding is that the neutron activation analysis of the smear on the curbstone where Tague was standing was nil, right?
I don't believe that material was ever analyzed by neutron activation.
There was an attempt made, and the result is nil. Now,
But it wasn't done.
Secondly, I forgot my second point. Oh, yes. Are you aware that after his testimony before the House Select Committee, Dr. Gwynn was asked about the nature of the samples he had tested, and he said that they differed in size, shape, and appearance from the original specimens?
Yes, I'm aware of that. I wish I had.
How can you have any reliance in Gwynn's study in view of that?
That's easy because these things they represented different aliquots, right? And the larger fragments get made smaller by cutting them pieces off.
But we don't know why they got smaller, do we? We just know they're different.
Large fragments are subdivided for neutron activation analysis because you require only a small amount. They also get a little bit smaller in weight because they have to be cleaned and scraped before they're analyzed. There are perfectly valid, non-conspiratorial reasons for changes. Changes in mass in the decreasing direction always.
But do you have any empirical data that shows that that is what caused the difference in size, weight, and shape?
Probably not.
Okay, that's
thank
it.
you very much. Before we go on to Mr. Wexler, we have a brief, I guess you would call it interlude, by Dr. Aguilar.
I need a couple minutes to take. Yeah, it's in the back here. It's right here.
Yeah, good. Okay, good. Then let's put this on.
Can I keep this afterwards?
I'll give you this. Not the whole jump drive, but what I want to talk about right now, and I think that there's some importance here, is that Dr. Ron has long maintained that the chain of possession. You want to just to get to exit. See, there's a jump drive. It recognizes it already.
All right. I got to get away from this.
Dr. Ron has long maintained the chain of possession of 399 is a solid one. It would stand up in a court of law. That we have no reason to suppose that there's any problem with the chain of 399. And yet what I'd like to present very briefly here is that, in fact, we have serious problems with the chain of possession of 399. And, in fact, the reason to suppose that the bullet that was analyzed perhaps for these studies and the one that is perhaps in evidence now was not the bullet that was found on the stretcher in Dallas originally. As soon as my...
There you go. Click
where is
we have
magic bullet? Here we go.
It has to open the program. I'll take a second.
So, if I may, this will come up in just a moment. The basics behind this is that in Parkland Hospital, a couple of employees, a fellow named Tomlinson and a fellow named Wright, found a bullet on a stretcher, called around, got a Secret Service agent to come around. They gave it to the Secret Service agent named Johnson, Johnsен, and that Johnson took the bullet over to the chief of the Secret Service, Mr. Rowley, and he gave it to the FBI. The question is, was that bullet found there? And which one of these do I need to click? Here we go. It's this. All right. In any case, was Commission Exhibit 399 really found on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital? Now, initially, there is a Warren Commission document, which I'm going to show you in a minute, called Commission Exhibit 2011, which is 2 out of 3 pages of an FBI letterhead memorandum dated July 7th, 1964, from the Washington field office to the Warren Commission, saying that an FBI agent named Bardwell Odom had carried the bullet back to establish the chain of possession to Dallas, and he'd carried it around to show it to the individuals who had had it in their possession, Tomlinson and Wright, and that Tomlinson and Wright had not put their initials on it, but he said, according to this letterhead memorandum, that the bullet resembled the bullet they had found that day. Perfectly reasonable to assume that perhaps that meant that it was probably the same bullet. In any case, there was no real reason to question that until about 2.5, 3 years later, when Dr. Thompson here rolled back around to discuss this issue and talk to Tomlinson and Wright. Tomlinson was quite nervous then and gave equivocal answers, but Wright was very forthcoming and straightforward. And when he came to talk to him about it, Tomlinson walked back, or Wright, who was then personnel director at Parkland Hospital and had a lot of experience with firearms, walked back into his office and he said, well, you know, it had a pointed tip. And Thompson said, pointed tip? And he says, yeah, hang on a second. And he sat down, pulled out of his desk, and put the bullet that you see in top right there on the counter and said, this is what it looked like. Thompson then showed him the bullet to the bottom right, and he emphatically rejected that that was the bullet that he saw that day. Now, that was in 1966, not too long after the events that are under consideration. In any case, went the wrong direction, sorry. Now, this is what the Warren Commission report says, that the nearly whole bullet was found at the stretcher, and it was determined in both investigations, both Warren Commission's and the House Select Committee on Assassinations, that the bullet that was found in the Parkland Hospital had been from a rifle found in the depository. I mean, there's no question on either sources that this bullet was the right bullet. Now, we don't need to go through this. This is 399. That shows how it's been flattened. The whole theory was that it went through Kennedy and Connolly and caused all of both men's non-fatal wounds, 7 wounds in both men. Here is Commission Exhibit 2011, in which, if this will advance, it's being slow. Here we go. Here is 2011. And it says, if you'll read the top one, regarding Darrell Tomlinson and O.P. Wright, I wouldn't mind having your pointer if you have it back, Tink. So, that Tomlinson stated that it appears to be the same one found at the hospital carriage at Parkland Hospital. This is taken directly from this letterhead memorandum, which Dr. Ron was passing around a few years ago. O.P. Wright said the same thing. Slug shown to him at the time. It looks like the slug found at Parkland Hospital. They didn't initial it, okay? Special Agent Johnson, however, said he could not identify this bullet as the one he obtained from O.P. Wright. I apologize about the poor quality of the typing here, but this is a high-quality resolution of not a very good original in the Warren Commission volumes. If you look at the original, it's not very clear. That's what it looks like. It's not very clear. In any case, the same thing about Chief Rowley. Like Special Agent Johnson, he said he could not identify the bullet. Said nothing about, well, it resembled it. He just said he could not identify it. Well, that's where it lay. We have the good FBI evidence from Bardwell Odom, an FBI agent in Dallas, that he had gotten these guys close to the event saying it looked like the bullet they have. And, of course, now we have Tink Thompson saying that, no, that's not what it looked like at all. And there the story lay until the mid-'90s when I decided to look back into it and enlisted Tink Thompson's help. Here's the 3-page FBI letterhead memorandum that Dr. Ron had been passing around in the mid-'90s, from which these 2 pages comprise Commission Exhibit 2011. And so here we go. This is a FBI letterhead memo, and this is this page here, and that's that page here. And it says the same thing that I just showed you in the previous slides, that they said that they saw a resemblance. It appears to see the same one, Tomlin says. Wright says, Bardwell Odom said, looks like the slug we found. Johnson says they could not identify this. Rowley says he could not identify this. Well, then all of a sudden, secret documents start pouring out from the work of the Assassination Records Review Board. And I direct your attention to the bottom paragraph here, which I'll blow up. This is from the SAC in Dallas to the FBI field office to the director, going right to Hoover. And let's blow this up right here so we can see this in greater detail. Now, this is regarding the FBI agents going back around to establish that chain of possession, presumably Bardwell Odom. For information, neither Darrell Tomlinson, who found bullet at Parkland Hospital, Dallas, Texas, nor O.P. Wright, personnel officer at Parkland Hospital, who obtained the bullet and gave the bullet to Special Agent Richard Johnson, can identify the bullet. Now, all you can see here is can identify. For information. So I put it together because it's on the next page of this memo. Neither one of these people can identify bullet. On 11/22/63, Rowley, Chief, U.S. Secret Service, Washington, D.C., gave this bullet to S.A. Elmer Lee Todd of the WFO, who on 11/22 took it to the FBI laboratory and delivered it to Special Agent Robert Frazier. Both Todd and Frazier identified the bullet by placing initials thereon. But you have now the internal record. The point here to make is that this is the record of that chain of possession. And nowhere in the original chain of possession does it say that these men saw that there was a resemblance in this bullet, or that a resemblance had been recorded by them. The original documents, in fact, imply that they could not identify it, end of issue and period. All right. And here is a once secret FBI report regarding Johnson and Rowley. And of course, here, if you focus in on that, and I have it typed up here, Richard Johnson and James Rowley advised FBI agent Elmer Lee Todd that they were unable to identify the rifle bullet, see one by inspection, and so on and so forth. So we have this situation where they can't identify the bullet. Tink Thompson says that it's a different bullet. Of course, Wright tells him it's a different bullet. So I called Bardwell Odom, and this is where the story gets very interesting. Tink said, "Why don't you call Bardwell?" And I said, "Well, is he still alive? Well, let's find out. Tink knows how to find people, I'll tell you." In about 15 minutes, I had his home phone number. I wrote him a letter, followed it up with a phone call, and Tink Thompson and I went to his house and sat down with him and showed him the documents. But these are from a transcript of a recording that I keep from when I called him after I'd sent him the documents showing that his name's on all these documents as having carried the bullet around. That's me, G.A. I sent you a letter 2 weeks ago, apparently. You went into Parkland Hospital and showed a couple of employees there, and then he interrupted me. He said, "Oh, I never went to Parkland at all. I don't know where you got that." Well, one of the documents said that. Bardwell Odom took this bullet around and showed it to a couple of people. I didn't show it to anybody at Parkland. I didn't have any bullet. I don't know where you got that from, but it's wrong. So I asked him, "Oh, so you never took a bullet? You were never given a bullet? You're talking about the bullet they found at Parkland?" "Right. I don't think I ever saw it even." If you go back to this document here, now the other thing that we established after sitting with Bardwell Odom in his room, he said, "Look, if I'd gone around at that era and had that bullet and showed it around to these guys, you can bet I would have written a memo about it. Even if now," and he was a very lucid guy, very bright, lucid guy. He said, "Even if somehow I'd forgotten having done that," which I don't believe I did, "if I'd done that, I would have written a memo about it." There is no memo. This is the only memo that exists on this. And there's no memo that actually supports what the Warren Commission heard from the FBI. The FBI, my own view here, given the bias the FBI had toward the lone assassin solution, was that they gussied the evidence, and that the evidence underneath it does not support the chain of possession that Dr. Ahn has such confidence in. I want to thank you for your indulgence here. Yeah, I'm gonna. No, let me just get rid of it. Gotta fix it out of there.
Just close it, and then we gotta. So the computer doesn't like it. You gotta do this little guy right there. Two arrows. Hit it. Now hit it. Now stop this. Top one. Top one.
Without giving the computer a hernia.
I don't want to get computer service. So I'm going to clear my stuff out of here. I'm going to give the photos to
We've run a bit over. I had promised Stu Wexler that he would have a half hour to respond to Dr. Ron, and we will allow him to do that. That means that the lunch break is going to be cut short. We will run till 12:15 and take a lunch, and then at 1:15 we'll be back here for to hear David Talbot of Salon.com talk about the reaction of the high and the mighty to the Kennedy assassination. I now give you this number that's been following me around. I just found out its name is Stu Wexler.
I wonder if they're going to accuse me of being a prime number next.
Done this a million times. For those who are not PowerPoint savvy, let me tell you, the world has passed you by. I'm hearing some disgruntlements on the part of the senior leadership around here, but let me tell you, it's over, fellas.
Is it plugged in? I'll briefly explain it. For this microphone or this microphone? Hi, I'm Stuart Wexler. I'm the integer. I'm going to skip over these first frames pretty quickly because I think Professor Ron did a pretty good job of explaining the difference here. At issue with the NAA is the difference between 2 bullets and 3 bullets striking both men. That's the evidentiary dividing line in the Kennedy assassination for the past 40 years. Most of us, if we don't expressly know it, intuitively know it. 3 bullets hit the men, we have a conspiracy. This I do want to touch on briefly. It's why you need something like the NAA to prove the Warren Commission's point of view. Medical evidence. Why doesn't the medical evidence help us decide? Because it can only speak to 2 separate individuals. It can't tell you the relationship by itself of the wounds of each man to each other. The Zapruder film. I think Professor Rohn and I would agree that the Zapruder film is pretty convincing evidence of a conspiracy, but we're not going to convince Professor Ron because there's just not enough detail in the Zapruder film, and there's just too much controversy over eyewitness testimony to settle the issue. Some of you have seen these trajectory analyses on ABC where they do straight line and show that the single bullet theory can work. That doesn't work either because that plays connect the dots with bullet wounds. You have to dissect the path of each bullet wound before you can determine a trajectory. Because the autopsy was so sloppy, we don't have that information. So you turn to something like the NAA. Can you, as Ken Ron says, associate the little fragments with the big fragments and conclude that there are 2 and only 2 bullets? I'm going to skip over this really quickly. Key points here are Q1 and Q9. Those are the single bullet, the famous single bullet, and the alleged fragment recovered from Governor Connolly's wrist. CBLA is comparative bullet lead analysis. According to Professor Ron and Dr. Gwynn, this is what you get when you group bullets according to their chemical profiles. 2 distinct groups, 2, and the emphasis is on the word only. That's going to become important later. Only 2 bullets, all from 1 rifle, single bullet theory confirmation because of the group there on the left. Is there an alternative explanation? I don't know if this was adequately explained, so let me give you a graphical representation. Imagine for a second you get these same 2 groups. I don't dispute the 2 groups, but in reality, one of the 2 groups is two distinct bullets. The Q9 fragment, in this case, comes from an entirely separate Carcano bullet. Now, you say to yourself, well, how absurd is it that two people would use Mannlicher Carcano rifles on the same day of the assassination? It's not absurd at all. If you think about it from the perspective of a coordinated conspiracy, if you go into Dealey Plaza with a 45, a 22 caliber, whatever kind, all different kinds of rifles and ammunition, you're setting yourself up for a manhunt. Because a police officer, by sight, on a crime scene, can tell the difference between a 45 and a 22. So you're going to want to coordinate your ammunition. It's not rocket science, and it's not absurd. Why should we consider the alternative? Well, we have the statements of Mr. and Mrs. Connolly insisting that the governor were hit by separate bullets. We have the Zapruder film, which suggests two separate shots. I would encourage you to read Professor Rohn's analysis, because I agree with it 100%. And you have the condition of CE 399 strongly mitigating against it having struck Governor Connolly's wrist. This is the age-old argument. What I always look to is the initial reaction of the wound ballistic experts on the Warren Commission when they were given CE 399, that 4 of them were asked to comment. And this is before politics has entered into the sway, before you know what the implications are of saying, this bullet couldn't have hit the wrist. 3 of the 4 were positive that this bullet could not have struck the wrist and deformed the way it did. Now, their opinions changed once politics entered into the fray, but their initial reaction, I think, is instructive. Experts who saw that bullet and were told it hit a wrist were convinced that it couldn't have done it, the vast majority. Is Dr. Rohn's work strong enough to convince a reasonable person that those doubts I just expressed are unwarranted? I have a picture of blood here up on the board. And within Professor Rohn's presentation, I think people might have lost what the key assertions are by the National Academy of Sciences. What was once the long-held opinion about Mannlicher or any bullet lead was that it had a unique profile. It was like DNA, or something close to. What the National Academy of Sciences has said, and I'll go into this a little bit more depth, is it's like blood type. Thousands of potential people can share the same blood type, and that has enormous implications I'll explain. First question you might want to ask, is CBLA strong at all? And again, by trying to, point me to the extreme end and not give a full fleshed out view of what my points are, it's easy to think, oh, I think it's a completely dead science. It's not dead. What they're saying is that you can't match a fragment to a box. Now, here's just a little piece of logic for you guys. If you can't match a fragment to a box, and you can't match a fragment to and you can't say anything beyond this bullet might have come from thousands of other bullets, how can you possibly say that a fragment came from a bullet to the exclusion of all other bullets? Take a look at this chart here. It's a chart of where Dr. Gwynn was at, Dr. Rohn has been at, and where modern science, National Academy of Sciences are at. It's important to note that Dr. Rohn has not analyzed any bullets himself. His work is derivative of Dr. Gwynn's work and the FBI. It's important to understand. Yet when Dr. Gwynn in 1978 looked at the issue and was asked the question, what makes up a bullet's chemical profile, he said at least three elements. Now, there's a trick to that, because in reality he only asserted that 2 matched, because copper was vastly different between Commission Exhibit 399 and the wrist fragment. And there's another catch, because when he asserted this to the House Select Committee in 1978, the figure he gave for silver was actually something that would have grouped the fragment with the head shot, not with the wrist shot. He changed that 5 years later. Professor Rohn is familiar with this particular dilemma. So Professor Rohn argues that you're okay to use 1 element. And I noticed something in his chart. He had 3 elements, he had 4 elements, he had 5 elements. There wasn't a chart up there for 1 element. And there's a very good reason why, and you're going to see what other chemical experts say about using 1 element to make your assessment. His statistics is based on 1 element. He can only conclusively claim that 1 element matches, and that's antimony. Modern science says at least 7. That's in their conclusions, folks. They say at least 7 was their recommendation for anybody making an assertion in a court of law. Now, maybe 5 diminishes it to 86%. We don't know what 1 diminishes it to, because they weren't even going to consider something that absurd. What can a forensic scientist do with their data? This is the key issue. Professor Ron and Dr. Gwynn both say that you can take a fragment, match it to a bullet, and reliably say that the rest of the bullets don't match this fragment. Other bullets in a box don't match it. Other bullets in the population, very unlikely that they match it. Now, when Dr. Ron put up the sign, the sort of gotcha moment about the matching of the fragments to a volume of lead, he didn't tell you what a volume of lead meant. Volume of lead means thousands, tens of thousands of potential matching bullets. And that's on a 7-element profile, not a 1-element profile. 7. And give you an idea of what that means, I wanted to go back to the idea of discriminants. Imagine I had a car, a witness to a getaway car, and all he told me was that the car was blue. Potentially thousands of cars would be included in that search. If he told you the car was blue Toyota, now you get to narrow your search down. If he said it was a blue Toyota 1994, now you can narrow it down even more. When you're going down to something like 1 element, you're talking about blue. You're not talking about a 1994 blue Toyota. So the potential to match thousands of other bullets is even higher in the analysis that has been presented to you. And finally, how strongly can you couch your conclusions? Dr. Gwynn said that you can have a high figure. In other words, you can say it's probably likely that this fragment came from this bullet to the exclusion of other bullets. Now, Dr. Ron, as you saw, he can say that there's something like a 98% chance that he's right. That's what he claims, and we're going to go into that. National Academy of Science says that you can't make any statistical claims. Any. We'll get to why in a second. This is something I would put up for my kids in class to try and gear them for the rest of the class. So I'm going to say, bullets are to blood as a bullet's chemical profile is to what? Blood type. Why? Because unlike DNA, thousands of people can share the same blood type, just as thousands of bullets can share the same chemical profile. And as a note on that, my colleague Tom Pinkston, who's a chemist who has worked with Mannlicher-Carcano bullets and has analyzed them, first 10 bullets we've analyzed, 8 of the 10 had the same amount of antimony in them. They would completely fool an analyst by luck. If Tom and I were to go hunting, and Tom were to pluck down those bullets, and he and I were to take them without any concern about the chemistry, and shoot at some deer, and Professor Ron or Dr. Gwynn were to go and perform a chemical analysis, he'd say there are only 2 bullets when there are 3. And more often than not. Because in that box of actual Mannlicher-Carcano bullets, from bullet to bullet, I don't care about intra-bullet, I care about from bullet to bullet, they match. And here's what Professor Ron has said. He has said that our case is different. We are looking at one kind of problem, and you guys, you're using the NAS, and you're using the NAS when they were looking at a totally different kind of problem. The argument is easily refuted, and I think because most people understand the difference between DNA and blood, I'm going to use that analogy again. Typically, a forensic chemist, like a forensic blood expert, tries to include or exclude a known specimen as having come from a potential donor. In other words, they look over here at this blood, and they see this suspect over here. Can we say that the suspect left blood at the crime scene? Note, if it were DNA, you can say 100% for sure yes. If it's blood type, you can say he could have left the blood at the crime scene. Similarly, with ammo and the kind of problem that the NAS looked at, they're saying, okay, we've got these fragments from a crime scene with a particular chemical profile. We have a suspect with a box of bullets. Could his box of bullets have contributed to the crime scene? Now, I'd point out again, they can't do that anymore. They can't do that with any reliability anymore. If you go into a court of law and you talk at the level of bullet boxes, you will likely have your testimony thrown out. That's according to the NAS recommendations. Now, here's the problem changed to what Professor Ron and others have said is a different set of problems. They are trying to count the number of bullets at a crime scene. This would be analogous to somebody looking at these blood puddles and trying to count the number of people who left their blood at the crime scene. But notice, when you're dealing with something as weak as blood evidence, you have an A positive and a B negative, two puddles. No one could say that it wasn't two people who left those A positive blood at the crime scene, because thousands of people share the same blood type. It's the same thing with bullets. If you have a profile of a bullet and thousands of other bullets were at the crime scene, thousands of other bullets can match those specimens at the crime scene, all you can say is there are at least two bullets. And that's an important distinction, because at least doesn't resolve the essential question of the Kennedy assassination. 2 bullets or 3 bullets. Now, maybe I'm talking out of my tail here. What do I know? I'm only a history teacher. Yeah, I collaborate with a chemist. Who am I to say? So I decided what I would do is I would go to actual forensic chemists and ask them the exact kind of question that Ron says is so different from what the NAS is analyzing. Maybe he's right. Maybe I'm completely out to lunch. It's a completely different set of circumstances. Even if you find only 2 groupings of antimony, which is what Ron focuses so highly on, what Professor Ron focuses on, the number of bullets may be higher. The conclusion should be there are at least 2 bullets. As far as reporting goes, I would think that I would conclude that X bullets were recovered from the scene, indicating at least X shots have been fired at the scene. An analyst can only figure out a minimum number of bullets fired by the suspect at a crime scene. Remember, the supposedly new, tighter scenario. They're all saying the same thing I am. At least. Not only. At least. And that means that effectively the NAA can't resolve the very question it's being asked to do. And things actually get worse. Because as I said before, you're dealing in this situation with an assumption of a 7-element profile, or a 6-element, or a 5-element. You're certainly not dealing with a 1-element profile. And the analogy to blood works here too, because blood has a profile. It has 2 components. It has the ABO and it has the RH factor, that plus or minus. So you might be A positive, B negative. Let's say I went to that same crime scene and I was trying to count the number of people who left blood at the scene. But I got rid of the RH factor. What does that do when I lower the standard of profile? Well, now I can't tell if that bullet in the upper right corner, that pool of blood, is from an A positive or A negative donor. If the bottom left is A negative and the top right is A positive, then I have at least 3 people. Contrary, if it's A positive and A positive, I have at least 2. When I lower the standard for a profile, counting becomes that much more difficult. The exact problem that Gwynn is trying to address becomes even more complicated and less and more vague. And I'm not the only one who thinks that using 1 element is not a good thing. This is from a German forensic chemist who didn't tell me either way whether or not he would allow me to use his name, so I didn't. He said it is necessary to measure all minor and trace elements, the 6 elements chosen by the FBI, when he was talking to me about that issue of counting. Certainly 1 is not enough, especially if it's an alloying element. 3 is a minimum unless the attempt to show is that 2 samples do not match. 1 element is not enough. Too much is left to chance and serendipity. Remember, all the statistics that you were presented rely on 1 element. Measuring just 1 element is a very dangerous concept. I wrote to a court-certified NAA expert, somebody who actually goes to a court of law and testifies using NAA about bullets. I asked him the exact question that Professor Ron presents, even though I don't agree with all the elements. That B part about the independently showing only 2 bullets, I don't agree with that. But I asked him anyway. Would that allow you, would that permit you to reduce your standard? My response to lowering the bar as to the profile is no. And this is my favorite one. The one element assessment is absolutely ridiculous. What makes this so key is that the person who did it is the only other person I know of besides my colleague Tom, who's analyzed Mannlicher Carcano bullet lead, and he is the only other guy besides Dr. Gwynn who's done it with NAA. He says using one element to distinguish them is absolutely ridiculous. Biggest problem of them all, the problem of bias sampling. Now, maybe the vat of bullet lead that gets sent out there produces bullets with a unique range of antimony from the tip to the bottom. But what Tom has shown is that bullets, even within the same box, can share the same levels of antimony, which is the only question that matters. If 2 bullets can produce a set of fragments that look like one, that's all you need. Well, it turns out that when bullet boxes are shipped, there is now an acknowledged bias in the distribution of lead profiles. In other words, if you ship bullets to Toledo, they might all look like Commission Exhibit 399. If you ship bullets to Dallas, they might look like something completely different, the bullet that shot General Edwin Walker. Everything, and I can't emphasize this enough, everything that advocates have inferred about the population of Mannlicher Carcano bullets come from one man, John Nichols, and his 14 bullets. We do not know where these bullets were bought. We do not know because we don't know about any manufacturer. This is one of the problems with bullet lead analysis as a whole. How Winchester specifically shipped them, because they don't pay attention, they don't care. And we do not know where Oswald bought his ammunition. What does this mean? And I'm going to explain this in a little bit of depth. The foundation of virtually everything that has ever been asserted about Mannlicher Carcano bullets and Mannlicher Carcano bullet boxes could potentially be skewed. And let me explain what I mean. That general linear model analysis, I invite you all to consult with any PhD statistician and ask them, if I have a bias sample and I cannot quantify the bias, can I infer the population reliably? You will be told no. It doesn't matter how sophisticated your analysis is, if you can't rely on your sample, if it's biased and you can't assess the bias, all of your inferences could be wrong, could be drastically wrong. Let me demonstrate this. Politics. We happen to know that political views tend to be geographically distributed as well, just like bullet boxes and bullet profiles. Now let's suppose I did a focus group and I didn't tell you from where. And it was on the Iraq War, and I said 65% of the people I analyzed in this focus group support the Iraq War. And then I went the next step and told you, I think 65% of the population of the United States supports this view. And I didn't tell you where these people were from. Now imagine what the implications were of that, not taking into account the bias. If they were from Crawford, Texas, I would say, well, I suspect that the rest of the country would probably have a considerably lower opinion about the war in Iraq. If they were from San Francisco, California, I'd be shocked, but I'd also say, well, now I would probably think that maybe 80–90% of the population supports the Iraq war because we know what people in San Francisco tend to think, and they're largely in favor. If it was from Des Moines, I would say, well, maybe it is an accurate representation. But the key is, if I never tell you where they're from, you're never going to make a reliable determination about the rest of the population. Now again, I reemphasize, you can talk all you want about from tip to base of a bullet, but unless, for some unknown reason that I've never heard of, you can tell me that they ship these bullets differently than every other bullet that's ever been shipped and analyzed, you're still going to fall at the feet of the geographic bias problem. And if you can't tell me anything about where Nichols bought those bullets and the kind of bullet boxes that were shipped there, that leaves open the potential that when whoever it was, let's say for the sake of argument Lee Harvey Oswald, bought his ammo from where we don't know, got a box, it just happened to have a few extra bullets that would match Commission Exhibit 399. Not for any other reason than pure chance. But we can't assess that. There is missing information. Thought people might get a kick out of this. How many people here actually believe that I once dunked on Shaquille O'Neal? I bring this up for a reason. Theoretically, it's possible that I once dunked on Shaquille O'Neal. Theoretically, Spud Webb was 5'7" and he won the slam dunk contest, and Shaq, he plays pickup basketball with regular people, occasionally. Both things are incredibly rare. Both things don't happen very often. So when you combine them together, it becomes even more absurd. We're being asked by the Warren Commission to believe two freak events happened to the same man. A bullet strikes one of the hardest bones in the human body and emerges virtually intact after going through two people. And he happens to have a freak neuromuscular spasm later on in response to a shot from the rear. Two completely rare events. Now imagine if something happened to one of your relatives and somebody came to you and said, yeah, this is how it happened. One bullet went through two men, struck his wrist, and it looks like this, and he had a neuromuscular spasm. I submit to you that you would spend the rest of your life trying to figure out what actually happened. Whether you had positive evidence that it was wrong or not, you would know that it just doesn't fit right. It doesn't fit. And my question then is, if you were willing to do it for one of your own relatives, why does John F. Kennedy deserve any less? Thank you.
Okay, we have a couple of quick announcements by Natalie, and then we're going to have to take a very fast lunch break.
If you are a speaker or a panelist and I have not talked to you about your dinner attendance, please see me. And also, could Howard Arena, Dan Griffith, Brian Rooney, and Arpaul Swickard please see me as well. The archives are also going to be open this afternoon until 7. And if you're interested in going there like tomorrow afternoon, please see me so we can get a feel for how many people would be interested. Thank you.
Folks, I just wanted to mention that the aforementioned display items regarding the DVD set from the November Pittsburgh conference will be set up just following the lunch break back here next to Andy Renarsik's stand. So please come take a look. Thanks.
Here's what's ahead on C-SPAN. Next, a